Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be yet another great late night chat. So, yeah, let's do it. Let's have a great late night conversation.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. I hope you're having a lovely July. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment here, and I'm enjoying July. Had a wild interview this afternoon, which hopefully you all will get to see pretty soon. It was pretty awesome. Got a lot of great stuff going on. A lot of good things are happening. But for those of you who may not be familiar with these streams, let's just remind people how we do them. First, I do the roll call. First, I give my opening remarks where I call you all. First, I give my opening remarks, which is just whatever it is I want to talk about. Then from there, we do the roll call where we find out who is on the other side of the camera, names and locations. Always fun to find out who's in our audience. Then after that, I answer your questions for the rest of the night. So if there's a question that you would like me to answer in the second half of the show, if you're on Rumble, send me a Rumble rant. If you're on YouTube, send me a super chat. If you are on Facebook, you're not shit out of luck. You can just go to YouTube or Rumble and you can send your question. I can't do it over Facebook, but it'll be all right. It'll be fine. So yeah, that's the way we do things here. First, the opening remarks, then the roll call, then I answer your questions. Now, couple announcements coming up. First, we have morning messages every morning on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel. Every morning. And we're trying to keep the momentum going. We want to have them every morning. It's going to be a great morning message for tomorrow. Some of you may already know what it is, but if you don't know, it's going to be a nice surprise. It's on location, so to speak, and it's going to be great. And it's really awesome. And we've been having a number of our members stepping up to the plate and making morning messages. It's just been absolutely delightful what our members have done. So tune in every morning on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel to see another member of our community give a message of hope and optimism for our organization, for our members to start the day with. It's a really great tradition that we have here at the Center for Political Innovation. And, we want to build up the momentum of this. We want people to be watching messages every day. It's a way that our community can kind of stay intact. We can, with the principles and the ideas that this community is all about, hold people together, give people hope, give people optimism with our optimistic, constructive socialism and anti-imperialism. We are not wreckers. We are not destroyers. We are city builders. And we do this every morning. Morning message. And in addition to the morning message, if you want to make a morning message, we now have a very special link for making morning messages. So if you want to make a morning message of your own, you can submit a morning message at this very special link that Peter Coffin created. And it's perfect. And it takes it directly to us. Then we screen it. Then we put it up. You barely have to do anything. You just go to this link and you can submit a morning message. So if you have an idea for a morning message, if you think that you would like to share something and help members of our community start their day with revolutionary hope and optimism, why, you can also submit a morning message, and it's a great thing that you can do. We have this new link where you can submit a morning message. So we would love to have you submit a morning message. And so, yeah, the morning messages, that's a part of our CPI community and what we do as a community, how we support each other, etc. So if you have an idea for a message, by all means, send one in, and be sure to tune in and watch the morning messages. We've been doing them every day, and there's been a steady flow of morning messages. And I'm hoping that as we continue to do them, more people will be watching and tuning in every morning, and it'll become more a part of everyday people's lives, more part of our community. We are a community, and we support each other. And so this morning message is a way that we can support each other, help people in our community start their day with revolutionary hope and optimism. I think it's a great, great thing. I think it's a great thing that we are doing. So if you are able to contribute to that or just watch it, great, great thing to do. Another interesting thing that's worth pointing out, and this is an interesting one. This is an interesting announcement. So I have an interview that will be happening live on this channel on Friday. And it's going to be an interesting one. She interviewed me for her show. Right? She has a show that she does, and her show is called Jesus, Guns, and Babies. And it's the show that she does. It's on her YouTube or on her Rumble, and it goes on. I think it goes on a network, a TV network in Georgia, or a radio network in Georgia. I don't quite understand exactly where it airs, but there is it does air online somewhere, on the air somewhere, in addition to not just being a podcast. But she interviewed me for what I thought was a podcast, but I guess it goes on the air a little bit too. It's called Jesus, Guns, and Babies. And it's Candace Taylor, who is a Republican activist in Florida. She was the Republican candidate. She was a Republican candidate for governor, and she's prominent Republican. She's got, and she's a conservative and a Trumper, and she's certainly against the deep state and against the establishment. So she interviewed me for her podcast today, Jesus, Guns, and Babies. It was actually an amazing conversation. And so on Friday, I am going to return the favor. And on Friday, Candace Taylor will be on this YouTube channel. So tune in on Friday. I will be interviewing Candace Taylor, a Republican from Georgia. And she will be talking about her life and, her political activism as a Republican and as someone who's anti-war and is against the deep state, etc. The host of Jesus, Guns, and Babies, she will be coming on this channel. And it's going to be interesting. And I'm really, really glad. I think we had a great conversation. I hope that it goes online soon, or it was just a really, really great conversation we had on Jesus, Guns, and Babies, her podcast this afternoon. I'll be posting it as soon as it goes up. It was really, really great. And so she's going to come on this channel on Friday. So make sure that you watch on Friday, 9 p.m. It'll be live. You can send super chat questions, etc. It's going to be wild. So I hope that you come, right? She is certainly from a different background than I am politically, but there's a lot that we agree on. Because we are at odds with the woke left, and we are at odds with the deep state. We are anti-war. We are anti-degrowth. We are anti-lockdowns. We are anti-election fraud. We are in favor of growth and development. We don't believe in degrowth. We don't believe in impoverishment. So I think it was a success this afternoon, and I'm thinking it's going to be another success. Dot Green for Peace is out in Georgia, and she appreciated it. And I think it was a really successful conversation. So make sure that you tune in this Friday when I chat with Candace Taylor here on this channel. She interviewed me about myself and my life. I'm going to interview her about herself and her life. And I think it's going to be very productive. And it was already very productive. So we got that. And those are the two announcements that I just had. So morning messages, upcoming interview with Candace Taylor. A lot is going on. I've been telling people to mark their calendars for July 12th, 2025, Chicago area. we are going to have a mega anti-imperialist rally next year. And CPI, we had a great meeting this afternoon about, some of the outreach that we're doing and the connections we're building in the lead up to everything we have to do this year to make sure that that event next year is a success. So mark your calendars for our upcoming, what's going to be happening a year from Friday. It's going to be awesome. And so on that note, quick reminder, opening remarks first, then the roll call, then I answer your questions. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of the show, by all means, send a super chat or a Rumble rant. The second half of the show is all you guys, so keep that in mind. So without further ado, I am going to jump into my opening remarks. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about in my opening remarks is I actually got some bad news today. And the bad news that I got is that somebody that has been a longtime friend, not someone I was deeply close to, but somebody that I did know and someone that I loved. I really did have love for this person. He was just a very kind, genuine person, an optimistic person. He died. And that person was somebody that, he was at Occupy Wall Street when I was at Occupy Wall Street. He was involved in all kinds of anti-war activism I was also involved in. He was a socialist and a leftist that I was involved in. He was a great man in so many ways. Paul Gilman, he died. And I did not know this. I got the news rather late. Apparently, he died at the end of May, which is shocking for me because I interviewed him on May 1st at the Palestine rally that happened. I interviewed him, and I'd interviewed him a number of times. And I actually went through some of my old YouTube videos, and I found clips of Paul. And I want to tell you about Paul. I want to talk to you all about Paul. So here are two clips of Paul from Palestine rallies where I interviewed him. One was many years ago, and the other one was the more recent one in May, which was just a couple weeks before he died. He apparently died at the end of May. So this is Paul at Palestine rallies.
Lives do matter, but so do Palestinian lives matter. And for them, they mean only Jewish lives matter. They don't care about anyone else. It's showing the true teeth of the oppression of this country. They say we're a free country, but the minute we do something they don't like, they send the cops in on us. If that's not fascism, I don't know what is.
So I want to tell you the context, right? So this first interview, this was at the height of Black Lives Matter, at the Black Lives Matter protests. The pro-Israel forces in New York City decided to have a rally called Jewish Lives Matter. And it was basically saying you have to support Israel because Jewish lives matter. And he protested it. And that's the comment that he's making, that he made. I was working for Press TV. This is years before I even worked at RT, right? This is over a decade ago. And he was a Green Party candidate for New York City Council, I believe. And he said,
Jewish lives do matter, but so
he's saying Jewish lives do matter, obviously.
do Palestinian lives matter. And for them, they mean only Jewish lives matter. They don't care about anyone else. It's showing.
And that was what he was saying. He said, look, we don't obviously disagree that Jewish lives matter. We don't want Jewish people to be harmed. But what about Palestinians? And that was a good point. And then this is him talking about the crackdown on pro-Palestine protests that happened across the country. I interviewed him about that on May 1st. And this is, very recently. This is just before he passed.
It's showing the true teeth of the oppression of this country. They say we're a free country, but the minute we do something they don't like, they send the cops in on us. If that's not fascism, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and so that was on May 1st at the Palestine rally. So I've got some other video of Paul, but I want to tell you about Paul, right? Because that's the tricky thing. When somebody is alive, you don't know, and I'm constantly wondering what the right thing is. If someone's alive, you don't want to talk too much about them and their personal life and their background and their life story on YouTube channels because you don't know how much they want to keep private. But Paul is now deceased. So I'll tell you what I knew about Paul. And then we'll watch some more footage of Paul. Paul loved marijuana. All right. And then you can see that in the clip I just showed. He's wearing a baseball cap with a pot leaf on it. Paul loved marijuana. And the way Paul got to be political was that Paul was apparently a marijuana dealer. as a young man, and he got arrested, and he did some serious prison time in upstate New York. He was a young man. I don't know where he's originally from, but he was a pot dealer. Nowadays they're much more soft on that kind of thing, but Rockefeller drug laws, etc. He was a pot dealer, and he ended up doing some serious prison time. And it was during that prison time that Paul became political, and it was in prison that he started reading. He started reading the political stuff. He started reading about the Black Panthers. He started reading about socialism and communism. And he came out of prison as somebody that was an activist, right? I think this was in like the 70s or 80s. I think it was the 80s that he went to prison. And he came out of prison politicized, right? Because there was a movement, what they called a movement in those days. And there was, and he came out of prison as somebody who admired the Black Panthers, and he admired Native American activists. And as a result of being in prison, and in prison, you have a lot of time to read. And that there's many people who, maybe not as much anymore, but at one point, there were a lot of people who got very politicized in prison because they would read books, and books were available. And so he came out of prison as a politicized person. And Paul had a very hard time. I mean, being a convicted felon, it was not easy for Paul. But Paul was at all the rallies. He was at every anti-war rally that the Workers' World Party organized. He was at all kinds of demonstrations. And Paul was a communist. I don't think he was ever in any party or group, but he was very much a communist. And more specifically, he was a Maoist. And that's a bit of a contradiction because Mao Zedong was not a big fan of drugs, but, he was a marijuana legalization activist. And he was a Maoist communist. And my fondest memory of Paul is in 2019, I gave a class. This is before CPI got started. We had something called Students and Youth for a New America. And Students and Youth for a New America never really turned into a real group. It was always just kind of, there were a couple people in one or two campuses doing something, and I would rent a studio classroom in New York City and do something. So we rented a studio in New York City, and I did a class called Mao Zedong and American Socialists. That's what I called it. I had no idea that Paul was coming. But Paul showed up to the class, total surprise to me. I knew Paul from protests. He was a friendly guy, but I'd never been over to his home, and I didn't know him intimately, but he showed up. He brought his girlfriend with him, and he brought books of his own to the class, and he was so into it. And, I'm going to show you the contribution that Paul made to my Mao and American Socialist class. I'm just going to show it to you because when you watch it, you can tell how into communism and into Chinese communism Paul really was. He was a history buff. He was a communist activist, I'll get to that, Noah, but Paul is one of the many unsung heroes. We need to talk about people like Paul, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, Noah, but there's so many great people like this, and we need to talk about people like this. And I'll get to that later. But let's just watch, and we're going to watch Paul's contributions to my Mao class. This is what Paul said, the contributions he made to my class on Chinese history, filling in the gaps of where I missed it, talking about what he thought was important.
Chiang Kai-shek had killed Mao's first wife and sister.
Wow.
And it was Stalin that ordered, and they were deciding what to do. It was Stalin that was said, well, you got to form a united front with the KMT. And, like Mao and his party were still deciding what to do, Stalin stepped in and did it. Now, the reason the generals did it was two reasons, right? The first reason is because the KMT refused to fight the Japanese. They had retreated as far as in southeast Western China as you can get and still be in China. You know, they were in Chongqing, and you know, they were hoping that the Japanese fascists and the Manchukuo would wipe out all the communists. They couldn't do it. By then, the communists were in Yan'an, which is after the Long March. They had made it there. Now, in the very beginning, you kind of left this part out, which is kind of important. When Trotsky and all of them were talking about a united front with the KMT, the Soviet Union had sent a general, and they founded what they called the Whampoa Military Academy. The Whampoa Military Academy is where both sides started getting their armies. An interesting note to that, Chiang Kai-shek was the president of, or the chancellor, whatever they called the head of that. The political commissar was Zhou Enlai. And on a little interesting minutiae side note, Ho Chi Minh was the translator because he could speak Chinese, Russian, and Vietnamese. He was in, you know, when they found, he was in Moscow, part of the Comintern. So Ho Chi Minh was the translator between the Russians and the Chinese. The Dalai Lama himself admitted that Mao was a great man. And you always see the hints of, in the Bertolucci film on the Tibetan Lama, when he's leaving, the last thing they did was commit human sacrifices, these lamas. Yeah. And this is actually hinted in the movie where the guy who plays the Dalai Lama turns and says, "Is this necessary?" And the reactionary a-holes that are actually the political powers in Tibet say, "Yes, it is." And
so here's a funny story. I'll just share this before Paul continues. Speaking of the Dalai Lama, I just remembered this, but you know, I used to do a lot of activism near Union Square, and you know, Union Square, the political group I was working with, they had their headquarters like up on 17th Street, which was, you know, pretty close to Union Square. And Paul used to just hang out in Union Square, right? I think he would, you know, get baked and he would smoke his pot and he would be just kind of hanging out in Union Square sometimes, or whatever. So one day, me and a couple of friends, we were in Union Square, and we saw the Dalai Lama, the Tibet separatists had gathered, and they were having an anti-China demonstration. So, they were having an anti-China demonstration, and I remember, you know, me and a couple of my friends, we wanted to disrupt it, and I had the little red book by Mao, and so we walked by it, and we just like started waving the little red book and chanting Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong. We did not know that Paul was there. Paul was just kind of there hanging out, and so we were disrupting, kind of, you know, shouting at the Dalai Lama, the Tibet separatists, as they were protesting, and we held up our red books and we were chanting like Mao, Mao, Mao Zedong. And Paul, out of nowhere, Paul appears and he's laughing his head off. And he's just got this big grin on his face, like, you know, he was totally surprised that we were there. And he, being somebody who was a sympathizer with Chinese communism, he got a big grin on his face and he was like giving us a thumbs up. And he was like, yeah, that's awesome. We made his day. We made Paul's day by disrupting the Dalai Lama Tibet separatist rally that was happening in Union Square when he just happened to be hanging out in Union Square.
Point out another.
It was kind of sweet. So there we go.
Sacrifices, these lamas, yeah. And this is actually hinted in the movie where the guy who plays the Dalai Lama turns and says, "Is this necessary?" And the reactionary a-holes that are actually the political powers in Tibet say, "Yes, it is." And I want to point out another book. This is C.K. Yang's book. C.K. Yang was a American sociologist from Hawaii who actually went to China. I think this was his ancestral village in southern China. And C.K. Yang did a really intense, minute sociological study of this village. And the big thing was the oppression of women, which was, he wrote about that extensively, and the hierarchies within the Chinese family. And then he also wrote about the oppressions. So that was from 47 to 48, and then from 49 to 50, he was in the same village. He was there for 4 years. He studied the transition to communism, and it should be a companion to Hinton. And I want to say one thing about Hinton's Fan Shin, the most, and this is a neglected book. I think all Marxists or people that should actually read it. It's very dense, it's boring, it takes a while to get through, but it's worth it, you know? But I'll admit it, I did it, I finished it. Okay, the most powerful, Hinton's book talks about the bottom-up transformation of Longbow, the village you mentioned, and one of the most powerful chapters is when half the world stood up, and it's all about the liberation of women. And the Communist Party didn't go in these villages and do this order and boss people around. They would send 2 or 3 cadres in there and find out who are the poorest peasants and have them lead the social movement. They would give them a little bit of training and do it. And in this, by then, Longbow was firmly in communist hands. They were doing the numerous land redistributions. And this chapter, when half the world stood up, this woman was complaining to the cadres how her husband was beating her. So so they said, okay, well, they get all the women and they do what they call consciousness raising thing, which actually eventually was a big, powerful movement within the feminist movement. So they did this conscious, and all these women were talking about their husbands, and a few of the husbands were cool, but many of them were cruel. So they got together, they went after that woman's husband, and they gave him a chance to either apologize or leave. He refused, so they beat him up. And then they went to all the bad husbands, and there was like a little bit of a counter thing, and some of the husbands said they're sorry and learned their lessons. Some were just complete assholes. They kicked their asses and they chased them out of the village. And then the big thing with this, and even in this movie, was a transformation of women in the revolution, because they were the most oppressed. I'm agreeing everything you said, and I'm just expounding, sorry about that.
Yeah. Any other comments? And then I have some conclusions before we conclude.
Except Paul, no Paul comments.
Yeah, come on, Sanders.
He's a dapper gentleman.
Hey, I really appreciate this whole lecture. It was great. Unfortunately, 2 hours is not enough.
Yeah. No.
So I cannot complain that you had to skim over certain parts. There's nothing you could do about it. I'd like to comment on your opening statements with the racism. And there is a certain, I wouldn't call it racist in the American left, but it's certainly Eurocentric chauvinism, that's what I would call it, are totally dismissive of the Chinese Revolution and do not take it serious as a topic. It's really frustrating because now you have a mass insurgency in India, the Naxalites, that are also based on Maoist principles. I mean, it's a big mess, but no one's even studying it. Whether you support it, whatever, there's very little interest in it, which is fascinating. And another aspect that I also found concurrent with the chauvinism is that the Chinese Revolution was very female-centric, in the sense that I mentioned C.K. Yang and the oppression of women. Well, Pearl Buck wrote, she wrote The Good Earth, right? Now, Pearl Buck spoke Chinese, she lived there and everything. Everything that C.K. Yang wrote is confirmed in Pearl Buck's book, The Good Earth, and people read the Pearl Buck's book and Good Earth and think it's about peasants bettering themselves through hard work and everything. That's really the subplot. The real plot of the book is the oppression of women, and that never comes out in any real discussion of it. And I think so there's not only the Eurocentric chauvinism against anything that doesn't come out of Lenin or Trotsky. And I love Lenin and Trotsky, and I love, I'm not putting them down. Marx was not a Eurocentric chauvinist, neither was Lenin. But a lot of their followers and a lot of the things that came afterwards were.
Yeah, and that was Paul. Paul was really well read, and he was really dedicated, and he would come to every rally. He ran for office as the Green Party candidate for city council a number of times. He he was just kind of a fixture of radical circles. And I'll tell you another Paul story that comes to mind, because Paul told me this many times. He told me this story. And I guess I'm going to tell this story not because the story itself is necessarily so important, but because of how important it was to Paul. I think Paul told me this story at least 7 or 8 times. Almost every time I saw Paul, he would tell me about this. And I guess Paul had a son. I never met his son, but he said he had a son who was disabled, had, special needs. And I guess he would always tell this to me, but the political group I was in for years was the Workers' World Party. And he told me that one time at the Workers' World Party office, they had a movie showing, and he brought his son, who was special needs, to the movie showing. And his son started making a scene and acting up. And Paul was really, really embarrassed about that. And the people in the Workers' World Party were really, really nice to Paul about it. They didn't, they weren't mean, they weren't annoyed. And Paul was just so moved by how kind they had been to him when his son, who had come to the movie showing, had been so disruptive and so, had made such a scene and been so rude. And he said he had gone and apologized to the party leaders, and they said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine." He said, "I won't bring him back to another event." And they said, "No, you can bring him back. If you can judge, you're his father. You'll know if it's right or not." And Paul told me that story 7 or 8 times because it was really, really important to him, because I think he was really embarrassed about his son who had special needs and how his son had acted. And the fact that the political group I was in didn't give him trouble about it, and even told him that he was welcome to bring his son back. When he was apologizing for his son disrupting the movie scene, they said, and that always came up because I was with I knew Paul when I was with the political group I was with, and I knew him afterwards. And anytime I mentioned the Workers' World Party, Paul would just tell me that story. Well, one time I brought my son to the event and he made a scene, and I was so embarrassed and I apologized. And they even told me that I could bring him back. And it was so kind. That was what Paul remembered about the political group I was with, was that incident. And it shows how important kindness is to people, that a little bit of kindness can go a long way. If you said Workers' World Party to Paul, what immediately came to Paul's mind was, this is the group of people that were so nice to me after my son made a scene at the event, and that's something that I think a lot of people really forget, right? Is that an act of kindness like that, can really mean something. And that, and I don't know where Paul's son is. I don't know who the mother of Paul's son is. I don't know anything about that. But I do know that Paul, Paul had been in prison. Paul had become a communist in prison. Paul had gotten out of prison, and that Paul was just a well-known activist figure in New York City, Green Party candidate for office, and that Paul struggled. There were times when Paul was homeless. He was not usually homeless. He usually had a place to live. But there were times where, Paul was struggling to find housing. Because he was a convicted felon, and having a drug dealing conviction on your record, it makes it hard to find a job. And there were times I would just run into Paul on the streets of New York. Sometimes I would see him in coffee shops. I would see him near Union Square, and he knew me. And also, when the cancel culture got going against me, a lot of the people that I worked with in communist groups, they would see me and they would look the other way. I'd see them on the street and they would look the other way, like they didn't know me. Not Paul. And Paul would always greet me, and Paul would always say, "Oh, I don't care for that. Everyone's always fighting on the internet." That was Paul's attitude, and he thought I was a fun guy to talk to because I was interested in history the same way he was interested in history. I was clearly a dedicated activist, as was he. He watched RT, and that was one thing I thought was neat about Paul, is because he had an anti-imperialist orientation, he watched RT. And when I started working for RT full time, I remember I ran into Paul one time and he had this big grin. He's like, I see you on all RT all the time, Caleb. Whoa, you're on there like every night, man. That's awesome. Like, he watched RT because he had been an anti-war activist, because he was, against the government and wanted to legalize marijuana. He watched RT. And so when I started being the RT reporter, he got really excited about it. And I want to tell you the stories about guys like Paul, right? And Noah said, what did Noah say earlier? He said, I've never heard of Paul. Well, no, you wouldn't have heard of Paul. Paul is one of the unsung heroes, right? Never heard of Paul Gilman. What you're describing sounds like a lot of new communist movement activists. That's very true. But people like Paul are heroes, right? And that's what I want to do, stories like this about people like Paul, right? I want to talk about people like Marty Goodman, right? I want to talk about them because, when I was in Russia for the planning meeting of the World Youth Festival, they talked about how one thing that the Russian government right now is really promoting and encouraging people to believe and to understand is that anyone can be a hero. Ordinary people can be heroes just by doing the right thing, just by protecting their community. And they talk about how during World War II, millions of Russian people became heroes because the Nazis invaded their homeland, and 27 million people in Russia gave their lives to drive out the invaders. And there were heroes in every town and every village and every corner of the country. And there needed to be heroes, or else they would have never been able to defeat the Nazi invaders. And that is a really important point, because just like Marty Goodman was a hero who organized Free Assange rallies, and even if there was just 5 people there, he was there. Paul is a hero. And this is what I would like people to understand. I think it is more important in a sense to do biographies of people like Paul and people like Marty, because we need more people like them. Let me just tell you, if we're going to save our country, we need more people like Paul and more people like Marty and more people that just do it, that see the job needs to be done. They need to build a movement. We need to build a movement against war and against the low-wage police state. And we need people who just do it. And it's these unsung heroes. These are the people that make a movement. You think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there were millions of guys like Paul who made Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We think that one man made the civil rights movement, but that's not true. Behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there were millions and millions of people like Paul, and there were millions and millions of people like Marty Goodman, and that we need people to do that. And that, unfortunately, because of social media and because of the way our culture is, people have it in their mind that that if you're not the center of attention, and if you're not, in the spotlight, that you don't count. And that's not true. That is not true at all. Everybody in the activist scene in New York City loved Paul Gilman. In fact, the way that I found out about his death was that a friend of mine who has run for city council, she was just a city council candidate who was part of Occupy Wall Street. She wrote an article honoring her friend Paul, and it was a member of our community. Shout out to Peter L. Peter L. saw the article that Marnie wrote, and he sent it to me, and that's how I got the news today, because Paul was a hero to everyone he interacted with. I want to show you something about Paul. This is one thing I will never forget about Paul. Right? And I'm going to turn the sound off. I just want you to look at Paul's face. There was always a twinkle in his eyes. He was always happy. There was always a twinkle in his eyes. There was always a grin on his face. Look at that. That's Paul. right? There was always kind of a happiness, a playfulness, an honesty underlying everything that he did. You know, Paul had been through, I mean, this guy had been in prison for a long time. I mean, I think almost a decade, maybe longer than that. I don't know how long exactly, but he did some serious prison time, right? And, you know, he was missing teeth and he, you know, I mean, he'd had some hardship in his life, but he just had this happiness, right? When you saw him, there was this twinkle in his eyes. There was this optimism about him. He stayed optimistic through all the hardship that he'd been through. And he wasn't just a communist on the internet. He was a communist activist. He needed to be part of the movement, right? He was at every protest he could get to. He was at every demonstration because it was like, that's what fed that happiness. He had that twinkle in his eye. He had that playfulness. He had that kindness. And that came from being part of a movement, right? From being part of an organization, not necessarily, I don't think he was in any particular party, but being involved in community struggles to change the world. You know, if you looked at his face, there was always this kind of glow because for him, you know, he read about communism. He'd read every book ever. He was a big history buff, but it wasn't just a matter of knowing about it in an academic or intellectual way. For him, it was a practice. It was a movement that he was part of. And he saw that I was doing this class and he totally surprised me back in 2019. I had no idea when Paul walked in with his girlfriend at the time and he brought like a stack of like 4 books about Mao. And he was just so excited that anyone was doing a class on Chinese communism. He wasn't going to miss it. When he walked in, I mean, he was so excited and he had this happiness on his face. Like this, I'm telling you about, this is why I will never stop being a revolutionary activist. It's because of people like Paul, right? People like Paul. You meet people like Paul when you do revolutionary organizing, right? He was 64 when he died. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. And you meet people like Paul who are inspired, people who are passionate about ideas, people who want to struggle for truth and justice. And that is why, I mean, I have been a revolutionary organizer, not just because I believe in the cause, but because it gives me joy. Being part of a movement has brought me joy, right? It has enabled me to connect with some really beautiful people. And it has enabled me to see that we can have something better because when we are together and when we are working together to struggle for justice, great things can be achieved. And you meet amazing people. And I want to share that with all of you. And that's why I called this stream Heroism in Our Time, because I want people to know what it means to be heroic. And I also want to talk about what heroism is, because I think that every person has a desire to be heroic. Let me emphasize that. I think that every person has an inner desire to become and be heroic. It's part of what it means to be a human being, is that you strive to be heroic. You don't just strive to eat. You don't just strive to sleep. You don't just strive to procreate. You also want to be heroic. You want to know that you have struggled to make the world a better place. You want to know that you have sacrificed for what is right. You want to know that you have made a difference in this world. I think the desire to be a parent is heroic, right? To raise a child, to have a child grow up, that you shaped them and you taught them and you helped them to live. Being a parent is being heroic. But it's not just through being a parent that one can be heroic. One could be heroic by being a teacher. One could be heroic by being a fireman. And that a basic human need is a need to feel that you are doing something right, that you are helping make the world better. You want to be a hero. Everyone wants to be a hero. And that brings me to a song from Scotland, right? And this is a song from Scotland, and it's a tragic song. And it's a song written in Scotland after the defeat of the Jacobite uprising. So what was the Jacobite uprising? Well, in England in the 1600s, there was a lot of political turmoil. Scotland was largely Roman Catholic, and the Scottish people, they revolted not for independence, but because they wanted to put a Roman Catholic king on the throne. And it was because much of Scotland was still feudal. And so as capitalism was arising in England, there was an uprising in Scotland by the Roman Catholics and by the old feudal aristocracy to try and put Bonnie Prince Charlie on the throne, a Catholic king. And the Jacobite uprising was brutally defeated. And after the Jacobite uprising was brutally defeated, there was a genocide against the Scottish people, right? The clearing of the Scottish Highlands. And it was a genocide that basically the peoples of the Scottish Highlands, the Highlanders, they called them, who would not abandon their Catholic faith, who were peasants and practiced feudalism and were at odds with the new Protestant capitalist order that was emerging in England and in Glasgow. They had their language beaten out of them. They were forcibly deported from the country, many of them. And it was a genocide. You read about the clearing of the Scottish Highlands. It was very much a genocide. And Scottish nationalism, which is different. The Jacobite uprising was not a Scottish nationalist uprising. It was an uprising trying to put this man, Bonnie Prince Charlie, on the throne, trying to make Bonnie Prince Charlie the king of Britain. But after it was defeated, and as the genocide against the Scottish people was taking place, that's when Scottish nationalism emerged, because Scottish people began believing that they were oppressed by the English and they wanted to be a separate country. And it was the mourning the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the defeat of the Jacobites that it was that pain of how they were genocided, they were defeated, they were crushed brutally, the Highlanders were killed. It was mourning that defeat that kind of laid the basis for eventually you had the rise of Scottish nationalism. And there's a number of very sad songs from Scotland that are about the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And what's interesting is if you go to Appalachia, right, you listen to a lot of bluegrass music. There are a lot of bluegrass songs that reference Charlie. Right? I think there was one. I went to a bluegrass concert when I was a kid, and they sang, "Over the river to feed my sheep, over the river, Charlie, over the river to feed my sheep and measure up my barley." Well, what is that about? That's about Bonnie Prince Charlie. Because as they were forcibly deporting all the Scottish Highlanders, a lot of them ended up in America. In fact, early Americans, 1600s, 1700s, if you are an American of Scottish ancestry and your ancestors came here around the time of the American Revolution, they were probably Highlanders who were forcibly deported in the aftermath of the defeating of the Jacobite uprising. So this is all interesting history to understand. But anyhow, that brings me to one of the sad songs that was written in the aftermath of the defeat of the Jacobite uprising. One of the songs mourning the death of, or the defeat of the Scottish uprising. And this song is called Ways Me for Prince Charlie. And it basically imagines that Bonnie Prince Charlie, the true king that they believed, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the true king, that he is reincarnated as a bird. And he's flying over Scotland and he's seeing all the devastation and all the killing, and he's just horrified. That's what the message of the song really is. It's the idea that the one true king, the rightful inheritor of the throne, that he's flying over Scotland, reincarnated as a bird, and he's seeing all the horrible, horrible things that are going on, and he's mourning for the Scottish people and how they are suffering. And the song has some particularly powerful lines in it, but I want you to first just listen to the song. This is called Ways Me for Prince Charlie.
We were come to your hall I world sweet and early, and the outcome his lilt was ways me for Prince Charlie. When I heard the bonny bird, the tears came dripping really. I took my bonnet off my head, for we'll Lord Prince Charlie. Said I, my bonny bird, is this a tale ye borrow, or is somewhat you've learned by heart, some little duel and sorrow? Oh no, the wee bird sang a flown since early morning, but second day of wind and rain always me for Prince Charlie. On hills that are by riders in, he roams a lonely stranger. On ilka hand he's pressed by want, on ilka side there's danger. Yestreen I met him in a glen, my heart near Boston fairly. Sadly changed indeed was he, always me for Prince Charlie. I know the bird saw some red coats and shook his wings way high. This is no a land for me, 'cause I while before the thunder wing, he departed fairly, but will I mind the farewell string, 'twas ways me for Prince Charlie.
Now that song, the lyrics are a bit hard to understand because they're written in the Gaelic, the Scottish dialect. It's English, but it's the Scottish dialect. But there's one particular line in that song that I think speaks to all of us. And I want to put it on the screen because, you know, it's very important. And I think it's very related to what we were talking about tonight. On hills that are by right his ain, he roves a lonely stranger. On every side he's pressed by want. On every side is danger. Now, what is this saying? I'll translate it for you. On hills that are by right his own, right? That's Scottish. It's ain, but it's his own, like that belong to him. On hills that are by right his own, he roves a lonely stranger. On every side, he's pressed by want, that's hunger and poverty. And on every side is danger. Now, why do these particular lyrics stick with us, right? What is this about? Well, the idea is that this bird is flying over Scotland, and this bird is actually the king, the rightful king. And these are his hills, but instead of ruling over them, he's all by himself as a bird. He's lonely. And he's seeing hunger and poverty and danger and killing and oppression. And that this isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to be. Because he's supposed to be the king who's ruling over his land. And instead, he's a lonely bird flying over his land and watching all this devastation. But I think this particular line, this particular couplet, really speaks to how all of us are feeling at this time. I mean, this basically speaks to the condition of a generation, but I would really say the condition of a country. Because so many of us in this time know that we are capable of greatness and know that we have a great heroic contribution to make. But instead of being able to make this great contribution, we are looking at the world around us crumbling and devastated, and we have an existence that is more and more alienated and atomized and isolated from other people. And we know that we should be in a greater position. We know that we should be doing great things, but we are not doing great things. We know that we should be in the company of other people, but we are alienated, and we are watching poverty all around us. We're watching the country fall apart economically. We're watching life become less and less stable. We have fear and anxiety about what could be coming. On hills that are by right his own, he roams a lonely stranger. On every side, he's pressed by want. On every side is danger. And if you feel that way, you are not alone in feeling that way. And I'll tell you why you're not alone. If you ever go to Barnes & Noble or any local community bookstore and you go to the fantasy section, right? Get a fantasy novel. Overwhelmingly, the plot that you will read about, and this is interesting, I don't read fiction very much, but if you read fantasy literature, one of the main plots that so many fantasy novels have, almost all of them have, is the story of the displaced king, or displaced queen, or displaced princess. So many fantasy novels and movies, they tell the story of a king, of a prince who's a prince, but he's suddenly lost his crown and he's living as a peasant. And he spends the story trying to regain his throne. Or a princess who's born to be the princess, but somehow she loses her crown and she's living as a commoner, but she spends the novel trying to get her crown, trying to reclaim her position. This is what so many fantasy novels are about. Why? Why is that such a popular plot? Because many, many people feel that they are kings, feel that they are queens, feel that they are princes and princesses, and they feel that they are living a life and have an existence that is not what they were meant to live. And you'll notice that the Ayn Rand libertarian literature really plays into these sentiments. I'm the temporarily embarrassed queen, y'all. That Ayn Rand literature is all about how the great man, the motor of the world, is suppressed by the mob of others. And that this plot device, even though there was no social mobility in feudalism, you were born into your title, you were born into your job. It wasn't just, princesses who were born to be queens and princes that were born to be kings. It was blacksmiths were born to be blacksmiths, peasants were born to be peasants, serfs were born to be serfs, nobles were born to be nobles, basket weavers were born to be basket weavers. There was no social mobility in feudalism. So the plot doesn't even really make sense in how feudal society worked. Nobody changed positions in feudalism. Didn't happen. But regardless, the reason that plot is so popular and the reason that a lot of people fall for libertarian, objectivist Ayn Rand fantasies and stories is because a lot of people feel that they have been deprived of what is theirs. And it is not simply that they aren't as rich as they would like to be. It's not simply that they aren't as honored and respected as they would like to be. It's also that they have not contributed what they would like to contribute. And that's a really important thing. It's not simply about the gains that they would get. It's about the satisfaction and the pride they would have if they were making the contribution they know they are capable of making. Right? It's easy to demonize somebody. Oh, he thinks he's entitled to having more money. He thinks he's entitled to being more famous. It's not that. Right? If you make it that just makes it easy for us to write the person off. But no, it's that the person feels they have a greater contribution to make. They could do more to make the world a better place. They could make a better contribution. They could serve a higher purpose. And the world around them is not giving them that sense of fulfillment. Instead, it's giving them more and more isolation. It's giving them more and more anxiety and fear. It's giving them more and more isolation and loneliness and hunger. And this is the condition that so many people in our generation are living in. And so novels about the displaced princess trying to reclaim her throne, or the prince who's been cast into poverty but spends the novel proving that he is actually the prince to regain his title. This appeals to people because on a subconscious level, they know they are not who they could be and who they should be. And the problem with all of this is that it individualizes it. It makes it an individual question. And by making it an individual question, you can't get to the answer. And that is why you can read all of those king and queen novels, or you can read Ayn Rand objectivism about the great men who are suppressed by the mob, the rabble, and you're never going to find the solution. by making it an individual question, by making people simply look at themselves, their own condition, their own life, how others may have treated them, by making it an individual issue, people get stuck in isolation and they don't find an answer. But the truth is, you're not the only one feeling that way. You may be even embarrassed that you feel this way because you think other people will accuse you of being entitled. You think other people think you're arrogant. What, you think you're better than this? You know? But I'm telling you, you're not the only one who feels this way. Almost everyone is feeling this way right now. This is the rage of a generation. This is the angst and pain of humanity in our time. Because what it means to be human is all about growth. That's what I'm trying to get you all to understand. Growth, creativity, this is the essence of the human experience. We are creative creatures. We build, we construct, we innovate. That's what it means to be a person. And if your ability to create, to innovate, to construct, to be heroic is deprived from you, you will feel a loss. You will feel a loss that will be hard to fill. There'll be a hole inside of you because you want to contribute. You want to build. You want to be heroic. That is what you want to do. Because that is what you are. You are a human being. You're not a beaver building your beaver dam the same way for 1,000 years. You're not an ant building an ant farm the same way for 1,000 years. You're a human being. And you're a human being and you want to create and you want to innovate and you want to expand and you want to invent and you want to take the world around you and adjust it and force it to serve you in a more efficient way. This is who you are. This is what it means to be a human being. And when you are deprived of that, it is an awful feeling. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. And it's nothing that you have in isolation from other people. It's not that you are so special and all the others are holding you back. No, it's not that. And it's not that you know that you have an entitlement and other people. No, not that either. It's that this system, capitalism in its economic crisis of overproduction, where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where people are hungry because there is too much food, where poverty is created by abundance, this stage of development, this moment in history, this prolonged capitalist crisis, is depriving you of the ability to be human. It is preventing you and putting you in a situation where you can't achieve what a human being is meant to achieve. You can't create. You can't innovate. You can't be the hero that you know you are capable of being. And that is the source of this frustration that you feel. And we are all feeling it in our time. But I'm telling you that while the ultimate answer is we need a society where the banks and the factories and the industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve the good of society and not the profits of a wealthy few. While we need a society where we have a rationally planned economy and growth is no longer restrained by the irrationality of profits, we need to move toward what we would call socialism. While that is ultimately the solution, Paul Gilman was a hero. Paul Gilman found a way, despite all the hardship in his life, despite all the ways that the world had been unfair to him, as somebody who had trouble finding housing, as someone who had been sent to prison over a stupid drug conviction, a victimless crime, he smoked some pot. He found a way to have a twinkle in his eyes. And he found a way to keep being happy. And I don't know every detail of Paul's life, and I don't know all the things that Paul did, and etc. I don't know everything, but one way that Paul found to keep that optimism in his eyes and to keep going was by being part of a movement. By joining arm in arm with other people to struggle for justice. By being part of a community and an organization of people. And utilizing whatever strength he had, whatever knowledge he had, whatever ability he had to advance a movement to change the world. Through being an activist, through being a communist, Paul was able to be a hero. I'm not saying he was happy all the time. I'm not saying that he didn't have a lot of difficulties in his life. But one way that he was able to keep himself going, and one way that he was able to keep that twinkle in his eyes and keep that grin on his face, was by being involved in a movement, by being involved in a struggle, by having comrades, brothers and sisters with whom he organized and with whom he could work to achieve the ends of changing the world. Paul was very bookish. Showed you how he was holding up copies of different books, but Paul wasn't just a history buff on his own. He wasn't just sitting in a web forum arguing with people about obscure aspects of Chinese history. Paul read the books. Paul studied everything. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being academic. There's nothing wrong with knowing this stuff, knowing facts and dates and history. But that wasn't enough for Paul. Paul knew that theory, divorced from practice, is pointless. Practice without theory is blind. But theory without practice serves no purpose. Marx said philosophers have only analyzed the world. The point, however, is to change it. It's one of Karl Marx's most famous quotes. The point, however, is to change it. Jesus Christ, the greatest socialist in history, they said to him, "How do we know that you are the Messiah? There's so many people who claim to be the Messiah, who claim to be prophets. How do we know that you're the real one?" And what did Jesus Christ say? He said, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." Ye shall know them by their fruits. My ideas put into practice is how you will know their validity and their effectiveness and their superiority. You shall know them by their fruits. The point, however, is to change it. And for Paul, these weren't just intellectual ideas. And it wasn't just a form of passive entertainment. Those 2 interviews I did with Paul, they were on the picket line. They were at protest, standing with the Palestinians. Paul might have gotten a lot of high from marijuana, but another way he got high was from organizing and from struggling and from standing arm in arm with his brothers and sisters. And I am striving with every ounce of my being to bring that joy to you, because that is the only way in my life that I have ever found true satisfaction. I am being dead honest with you. That's why, as much as I disagree with Bob Avakian, I owe Bob Avakian my life. I owe him a lot, because through his group, I found my way into a movement. They taught me to go out and sell newspapers on the street. They taught me to go out and do outreach, and they taught me to engage with people. And it's only been being in a movement that I have been able to find fulfillment. I never would have met my wife if I hadn't been in a movement. I never would have traveled around the world if I hadn't been in a movement. I never would have returned to my Christian faith if I hadn't been in a movement. I never would have had anywhere near the meaning that and the satisfaction that I've had in my life if it wasn't being in a movement. And that's why I'm on here night after night after night telling you we need to build a movement, and telling you I don't care if I win the internet. I don't care if I get the most likes and shares and the most views. And I'm not trying to win the internet. I'm trying to use whatever resources I can muster and whatever energy I can find and whatever people I can find who are willing to work with me, some of them permanently for a long time, some of them even for a short time. I'm trying to utilize everyone I can in order to build a movement, because what we need is a movement. We need a movement of people who will stand for truth and justice amid this breakdown of civilization, amid this breakdown of capitalism, amid imperialism in its decay. We need a movement. We need people who can rely on each other. We need a community. We need to struggle not in isolation and in atomized frustration. We must stand arm in arm together and organize and build something beautiful together. That is what we need in our time. And we need that urgently. And it's not going to look like it looked a generation ago. And it's not going to sound like it sounded a generation ago. A lot of things are topsy-turvy. I just did a podcast with a Republican called Guns, Jesus, and Babies. I just flew out to Los Angeles to speak to the Unification Church. I'm good friends with the Unification Church pastor and a Unification Church community in New York City. Right? I've got people on the left who hate me and want to kill me and hate my guts. This is a weird time that we live in. Things don't make sense. It's not left versus right, communism versus capitalism, atheism versus Christianity, science versus religion. It's not that simple anymore. Everything is topsy-turvy. Everything is confused. People that are on one side, if you say I'm this, it means about 10 different things to 10 different people. If you say I'm that, it doesn't mean the same thing to even 3 different people. It's all mumbled, jumbled, and confused. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at this point. Nothing makes sense. The old categories don't work. The old assumptions don't work. But what I can tell you is that there is good and evil in this world right now. There is good and evil in this world. And the evil is about unleashing your rage and unleashing your anger and unleashing your desire for vengeance and atomizing you from other people and getting you in a state of hopelessness and pessimism. That's what the evil is. And if I smell that evil dressed up as communism, I'm opposed to it. And if I smell that evil dressed up as Christianity, I'm opposed to it. If I smell that evil dressed up as capitalism, I'm opposed to it. If I smell that evil dressed up as whatever, wherever I smell that pessimism, that anti-human sentiment, that vengeance, that hopelessness, wherever I smell that evil, I am opposed to it. And what we need now more than ever is kindness and forgiveness and patience and solidarity and brotherhood and construction, optimism, hope, building. That's what we need. And that's why I got involved in movements in the first place, because I wanted to build. And that's why people love Stalin in Russia, because he built. That's why people love the Chinese Communist Party, because they built. That's why when I went to Venezuela, and I told Candace Taylor about this afternoon, I'm not sure she knew what to think of it. That's why when I went to Central Caracas in Venezuela, and I talked to the most hardcore supporters of Bolivarian socialism, they said, Chavez built all of this. Chavez gave everything to us, and God brought us into this earth. We will die for communism. We will die for socialism. They will never retake Venezuela. We will go down fighting because we want to build. You can look over the history of communism, and you can look at the bad things, and you can look at the good things, and you can go over the history of Christianity. You can look at the bad things, and you can look at the good things. You can go over the history of whatever you want. There are spiritual forces in the world today. And there is a force of pessimism and destruction and hopelessness and atomization. And there are lots of people that feel deep within their souls that that ain't okay. They want to build. They want to construct. They want to connect. They want to love. That's who I want to work with. And that's the kind of community I want to build. And we call ourselves the City Building Tendency. And we study Marxism, Leninism. We study all kinds of things. And that's what I'm doing here. And if you want to come do it with me, be my guest. And if you don't, I can't make you. And that's what I've got to offer you all. And that's what I think about. And that is my reaction to the death of my friend Paul Gilman. And that's what I have to share with you tonight. So those are my opening remarks, folks. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? I'll start calling you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Mark Jones in Utica, New York. The Seasoned Noob, Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. Noah in Boston, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Molly McGuire, Dan in Los Angeles, Bob in Troy, New York, Dan in Los Angeles, Timoshenko in St. Louis, Patch in Arizona, Philip High in Brooklyn in the house, Boris in Gary, Indiana, Patrick in Maine, Daniel Valle Duarte, Gabby in Chi-Town, Joe in Los Angeles, Joshua in St. Louis, John McCarthy in Chicago, April and Chris in Salt Lake City, Anthony in Detroit. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Mads in Massachusetts, Detroit, Anthony, April and Chris in Salt Lake City, John McCarthy in Chicago. Thanks for explaining the song is a forte for you. All right. Well, maybe I'll do more of that. Fingerman in St. Joseph, Missouri. Names and locations. Sorry about the death of your friend. Well, I have a feeling that he is in spirit world and that he's doing great things in spirit world. Alex in Brazil. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. All right. Dustin Schlesinger in Cleveland. James from Chicago. Rachel in Winder, Georgia. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Mariah in North Carolina. Welcome, Mariah. Good to have you with us. Good to have you with us. Names and locations. Who is with us? All righty. Well, we have 4 super chats here for me to answer. Let me check the Rumble. Oh, we have a Rumble rant too. Dot Green for Peace sent a Rumble rant. So we got a Rumble rant from Dot Green for Peace, Rachel in Georgia, and we got 4 super chats here, which is great. All of that is awesome. Oh, we got Amway in India. Welcome. So I do want to take this opportunity to remind people that if you would like to send a super chat, not only are super chats good and that they get me something to talk about in the second half of the show, super chats are also good in that they support my ability to do this work. Where I live in New York City, I've got a 2-bedroom apartment. I've got this extra room in order to, do my home studio and do my work and do these streams every night. So if you can send a super chat, it would help me pay my bills and help make it easier for me to live this New York City lifestyle. And, trust me, if I could live somewhere else where the rent was not so expensive, I would do it immediately. But my job does require me to live in this city so I can cover the UN, etc. But I do appreciate all the support you all are offering. And I do want you all to mark your calendar for July 12th, 2025, Chicago area. Right? It's coming up sooner than you think. It's coming up sooner than you think. So I would urge you all to mark your calendar for it. Oh, thank you, Joe. And on top of that, I would also urge you all to start watching the morning messages from the Center for Political Innovation that we do every morning. We got one going up tomorrow. It's going to be a good one from one of our members who's been doing some good stuff lately. I don't want to ruin it. But watch the morning messages every morning. Start your day with revolutionary hope and optimism with the Center for Political Innovation. It's always great to start your day with us and start your day with revolutionary hope and optimism. And on top of that, if you would like to make a morning message, which you now have the ability to do, I will, we will obviously have to approve it, but we now have this great link where you just log on and you can submit, your morning message submission. So submit a morning message if you want to make one. And we need morning messages. We're going to do one every day. It's not going to be easy, right? Rachel's done a couple of them, so far. And I did one, and then we had a video of our friend who went to Russia, our member who went to Russia for a meeting that just happened. And, we're trying to churn one out every single day. So we do need your help. And if you're part of this community and you like what we do, make one. That is our request. Submit a morning message. Go and get your phone. It just takes a phone, and you can use this link to submit a morning message. So if you can do that, that would be awesome. So there we go. So we've got 5 super chats, and then we've got the Rumble rant from Dot Green for Peace, Rachel in Georgia. So what I'm going to do now is I need a moment to take a drink of water and calm myself down after getting fired up there in my opening remarks. I'm going to put some music on, and after that music plays, then I will, at that point, I will then make a point of answering people's questions. So I'm going to put on Cornelius Cardew. And the reason that I'm going to put on Cornelius Cardew is because this is some of that communist music that I like, ironically. And we haven't played it on here in a while, right? So Cornelius Cardew is this communist, musician from Canada. And he was originally, or he wasn't from Canada, he was from Britain. He originally was like an experimental music composer, and he had some big revelation, and he decided that he was only going to compose what he called people's liberation music or communist music. And so the 70s and until his death in the 80s, he only composed this very, very communist music that has very, very forced lyrics, which is, I like it ironically. I like it kind of with my tongue in my cheek. But he became a Maoist, and then later he became a supporter of Albania and Enver Hoxha in Albania. And he composed these communist songs with very, very, I don't know what you want to call them, very, 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 very forced lyrics, I guess you could say. And I like them, but I like them kind of ironically, right? Now Caleb's going to torment us with Cornelius Cardew. Yes, I am. One song called, and it'll be in honor of the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is now back in power in Britain. And Cornelius Cardew, Timoshenko loves it, right? I like it ironically. I do admit that it's kind of like, okay, when you fit all the big Marxist words into the lyrics, it's like, are you seriously doing this? But there's something about it I just find enjoyable, because it's like he's getting the political message. He's making sure to get the political message right. That's what I like about it. He's communicating basic Marxist-Leninist politics, but he's doing it with his own, musical style. And Cornelius Cardew is fun. And he wrote this song about the Labour Party. It's called The Lords of Labor. So I'm going to put that song on while I get a drink of water and I calm down. So if anyone has any more super chats for me to answer in the second half of the show, now would be the time to send them. Hey, Funky gets it. It's an acquired taste, right? It's like a fine wine. Cornelius Cardew is an acquired taste. So this is the song he wrote in honor of the Labour Party. It's called The Lords of Labor. And the lyrics to the chorus are, oppose all attempts to make the working class pay for the capitalist crisis. You're going to love it.
The Lords of Labour, they put together the bankrupt schemes to keep us down. Their message to the working class is to cringe before the rich man's frown. They say that it's in the whole country's interest to tighten our belts and make no demands, but they speak for the class that exploits us and rules us, and we must get them off our hands. Our labour power is all we have. We must sell it at the rich man's price. This system is called wage slavery, but democracy sounds a bit more polite. They say that if our wage increases, the prices will rise to compensate. But the only ones who receive compensation are capitalist vampires who suck out our life. Oppose all attempts to make the working class pay for the capitalist crisis. Oppose all attempts to make the working class pay for the capitalist crisis.
The capitalists fight with one another to corner the market and divide up the world. The quest for maximum profit is the cause of war and puts us on the door. Their greed leads them into a crisis they try to resolve with a more fascist state. Our struggles against the whole capitalist system, so strike at the fascists as well as the cuts.
Oppose all attempts to make the working class pay for the capitalist crisis. Oppose all attempts to make the working class pay for the capitalist crisis.
Yeah, you guys don't know how important Cornelius Cardew is to me. I wrote a book called Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, you'll remember. And the opening quote in the book, what do they call that? The opening, what's that called? The epigraph? Is that what that's called? Where you have like a quote in the beginning? Is actually a quote from that song. It's, the capitalists fight with one another to corner the markets and divide up the world. That I used that as the epigraph. And the name Bread Tube Serves Imperialism was actually an homage to when Cornelius Cardew had his big revelation and became a communist. He wrote a book condemning the school of experimental music he'd worked for, which was the Stockhausen School. So he wrote a book called Stockhausen Serves Imperialism. So you don't know how important Cornelius Cardew is to me and my my political views. What I like about it is that you find a lot of like basic ML concepts crammed into one song. I see there's another super chat that came in. I do appreciate it. I'm going to do one more Cardew song because this is the song he wrote called Workers of Ontario. And it's about the working class of Ontario, Canada. And it's amazing. It's called The Workers of Ontario. And what's amazing about it is that it's very much like I when I first heard this song, I had the image of like after the revolution, some kind of Muppet on Sesame Street singing it with a hard hat on their head or something. This is I'll play one more, and it's called The Workers of Ontario. And he manages to fit in the Leninist concept of the aristocracy of labor into the song in one of the verses. Listen to the lyrics. It's very amazing. Listen to the lyrics of the song. This is Workers of Ontario, the Workers of Ontario. And imagine a Muppet singing this on your TV with a hard hat on after the revolution.
We are the workers of Ontario, the workers of Ontario. We hail from the north and from the south. In the north we mine the ore, in the south we manufacture. We are a part of the Canadian proletariat. We are workers of Ontario. We work for the rich of the United States. We work for the rich of Canada. We work under the yoke of wage slavery, hauling the riches out of the earth, manufacturing commodities for the rich to sell. We are the workers of Ontario, a mighty section of the Canadian working class. We are the workers of Ontario, the workers of Ontario. We hail from the north and from the south. In the north we mine the ore, in the south we manufacture. We are a part of the Canadian proletariat. We are workers of Ontario, long oppressed by the graft and corruption, brought into the organized working class by the blacklegs, the sellouts, the traitors, the labor aristocracy, those who swear by the name of capital. Big bosses of the auto workers stealing out the union. Every one of them wants our blood to be sucked. We are the workers of Ontario, the workers of Ontario. We hail from the north and from the south. In the north we mine the ore, in the south we manufacture. We are a part of the Canadian proletariat.
How do you not appreciate those lyrics? The last verse literally was, in the 40s, we fought against exploitation, and in the 50s, we never stopped. Many are the struggles that the rich will not forget, but yet they say they're for the capitalist system. But our ideology is Marxism-Leninism, and we're workers and like workers everywhere. Our aspiration is for socialism, ushered in by violent revolution. Yeah. What other song could cram that in to the lyrics? Yes, our ideology. I always just get a big grin on my face when we get to the final verse of that song, when she's like, our ideology is Marxism, Leninism, and workers like workers everywhere. Our aspiration is for socialism, ushered in by violent. And that last line, ushered in by violent revolution, they had to stick that in because they're Maoists, right? And because Khrushchev had presented, the three peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition, and peaceful transition. So to make clear that they were not revisionists, they had to slip the line in there, not just for socialism, but socialism ushered in by violent revolution. I mean, it's forced, it's cringe, but it's like, I don't know. I appreciate it in the sense that, like, ideology was very, very important to Cardew, right? Cardew had been this hippie. He had been this, like, counterculture hippie, drug-using guy who was into weird experimental music. And then he got his shit together. You know what I'm saying? He got his shit together. He said, I'm going to be serious. I'm going to believe in something. So he became an anti-revisionist communist, right? And I get it. If you read his essay, Stockhausen Serves Imperialism, you get it. Like, it was like the world didn't make any sense, and there was a lot of chaos and confusion and pessimism, and then he got his shit together. And that's why his music after that is so, like, rigid, right? Our ideology is Marxism-Leninism. I mean, it's like that because that's where he was, right? It was an expression of, he had been lost, and he had rigidly found an ideology. Yeah, I guess he had to make up for lost time. There you go. But it kind of makes sense if you understand the psychology of Cardew and, like, the way he saw things. And then, of course, Cornelius Cardew was like, he didn't mess around. He literally wrote a book, which I would really love to read. I cannot find a copy of it anywhere, called Punk Rock is Fascist. Okay. And his big contribution is he had some elected office in the Musicians Union of Britain. And so when David Bowie gave his interview saying that he wanted Britain to have a fascist dictatorship, he got the Musicians Union of Britain to condemn David Bowie. And then he wrote his book, Punk Rock is Fascist, arguing that punk rock music feeds into fascism. And I feel like that is, I feel like in a weird way, Cornelius Cardew and Lyndon LaRouche, like, if they are in spirit world together right now, they are, like, sitting down and comparing notes, right? Because Lyndon LaRouche was a Marxist who was very into music and really opposed experimental music, etc. And Cornelius Cardew was an experimental musician who then had this revelation and became a Marxist, and then wrote Punk Rock is Fascist. And I feel like Cornelius Cardew and Lyndon LaRouche have had some amazing conversations in the next life, in the world beyond. There's like something, they were kind of bonded together, because who thinks punk rock is fascist, right? But there you go. And that is where all these things are. I've listened to some of Cardew. You see, Noah is a, like, professionally trained musician, folks. You may not know that, but Noah is a professionally trained musician. I think we actually listened to some of Cardew's experimental music in university, and it's with objects, no traditional instruments, sounds like a bunch of noise. There you go. Okay, neat, right? I think the Scratch Orchestra was what he was famous for. Is that what that was? Because that was his experimental music. He did Scratch Orchestra. So that would make sense. But anyway, all right. So now I'm going to start answering people's questions. No more Cardew for now. He shall return. Don't worry. All right. Why does Western media say right-wing populism and left-wing populism? Are they gaslighting us? I don't understand why populism has such a negative connotation, or how it can be left-wing or right-wing. Well, that's interesting, Doc Green. So there's a lot there. I wrote an article on the history of populism, which was republished a lot of places. It's one of my better pieces, and it's on the history of populism, how left-wing politics became, anti-populist, and let me see if I can find it for you. It's one of my better pieces. Mint Press ran it, and I think Popular Resistance republished it. And, populism is an important thing to understand. So what is populism? Okay. Well, the term populist is a vague term. It just means that you're rallying the people against an elite. That is all that it means. You're rallying the people against an elite. And it's just kind of a catch-all. You're for the masses and you're against the elite, right? And so to some degree or other, all politicians are a bit populist. No politician gets up and says, I'm for the elite and you all are inferior. You're the masses, right? All politicians are populists to some degree. However, there was a movement in the United States that they called the populist movement, which is very important to understand. So after the U.S. Civil War, the Republican Party when it started was the radical party, right? That's why red is the party of the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Even the name Republican, it came from the fact that all over Europe in 1848, there were uprisings. It was the Spring of Nations, and there were over 200 different uprisings in Europe. And those uprisings that waved the red flag of the French Revolution, including the 1848 German Revolution, there was in Paris, all over Europe, there were mass rebellions in 1848, the Spring of Nations, and the people that marched in the streets to overthrow kings and monarchs and fight for the rights of peasants were called Republicans because they were fighting for the creation of republics and modern nation states. And so to be a Republican, it meant you wanted a republic, right? If you ever watched, I think there's a movie of Les Miserables, right? Of Victor Hugo's novel. And in the movie, right, as they're executing people, they shout, "Long live the Republic," and they get killed, the Republic, fighting for the Republic was the rallying cry of the 1848 revolutions. And the most radical people in Europe were called Republicans. And they even used to talk about red Republicans, they called them. And those were those who were so dedicated to the Republic that they wanted to have violence, etc. And 1848, the uprising of 1848, in the spring of 1848 in Germany, the German Revolution, that's where Karl Marx got his start. The Communist League, that's what the Communist Manifesto was written for. There was a group that participated in the 1848 German Revolution, and they were called the Communist League, and it was led by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they had muskets, and they were in the woods like Che Guevara, and it was an armed war, and there was one armed group in Germany that was trying to create a modern German nation state, and they were called the Communist League, and they lost. The 1848 German Revolution failed, and so Karl Marx fled to London, and from London, he wrote the Communist Manifesto to explain what his group, the Communist League, believed. That's where the Communist Manifesto comes from. And the Republican Party started out as the American wing of the 1848 uprisings, and it was founded in Free Soiler country. I believe it was started in Iowa, which was a newly settled state, and it was small farmers who were against slavery. And it was labor unions and small farmers and other people that were against slavery, and they were angry with the grip that the slaveholders had over the American government. And they wanted to defeat the British Empire, and they wanted to defeat the slaveholders. And their rhetoric, they talked about the producers versus the consumers. Now, they didn't talk about workers and capitalists because the producers were often small farmers. They weren't labor workers, but they talked about producers, the producing class versus the producing class versus the consuming class, those who create the wealth versus those who have it. And actually, there's a very, very good book on the history of the Republican Party called Free Land. I'm trying to find my copy of it. Free Land, Free Labor, Free Man. And that was the slogan of the Republican Party when it started. Free land, meaning westward expansion, small farmers. Free labor, meaning no slavery, right? No slave labor. And free men, which also meant no slavery. Free land, free labor, free men. That was the slogan of the Republican Party when it began. And Abraham Lincoln was a populist. He was this country lawyer who was known for sticking up for the little guy, who condemned capitalism in his speeches. Abraham Lincoln would get up and he'd say, the capitalists conspire to fleece the people. He gave speeches about how labor produces the wealth. Labor is more important than capital. Abraham Lincoln was a populist. He wasn't a socialist, but he was a populist lawyer. He was this lawyer who fought for the little guy in court. That's what he was famous for. And they needed somebody like Lincoln because Illinois was a newly settled state. It was kind of the Wild West back in those days. And he was this country lawyer, this very tall country lawyer who was known for fighting for the little guy in the courtroom. And they played up the idea that he was a man of the people. Right? Your presidents usually were people that were, from prominent, wealthy families, entrenched power. But old Abe Lincoln was from Illinois, right? And there's that song, Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness, came up. It was like they played up the idea that Abraham Lincoln was a common man. He was a working class guy, right? Right. Free soil, free labor, free men, the ideology of the Republican Party before the Civil War. They were a radical party. The New York City Republican Party newspaper was the New York Tribune. And the guy who was the owner of it was a socialist whose name was Horace Greeley. And he's the guy who said, "Go west, young man." And the London correspondent of the New York Tribune was Karl Marx. They hired Karl Marx to write for their newspaper. And Horace Greeley, who eventually was elected to the U.S. Senate, who was the editor of the Republican Party newspaper, the New York Tribune, was a Christian socialist who, he was an advocate of women's rights. And his slogan was, "Go west, young man." And there's a whole thing. I talk about this a lot. So the Republican Party, when it started out, was a very radical populist party. After the Civil War, the Republican Party divided between the radical Republicans and the moderate Republicans. And the moderate Republicans were very much the imperialists. They were part of the big monopolies and the big corporations. So the radical Republicans broke away from the Republican Party and they formed the People's Party. Right? And the People's Party was this new political party by Republicans who felt the Republican Party had sold out the ideals of Abraham Lincoln. And they wanted to continue the radical politics that had brought Abraham Lincoln to power. And they were called the People's Party. And they advocated nationalizing the railroads, public control of banking. I think they wanted a silver standard instead of a gold standard. They were for the silver standard. They thought the gold standard was oppressing people. They wanted to nationalize the railroads, and they wanted to create a national bank, and they were against the big corporations. And they tended to be Protestant fanatics, religious Protestant fanatics, and they were very anti-Catholic. They thought that Catholics were elitists, and they worked for the Pope and stuff. So they were very radical Protestants. They didn't like Catholics, but they opposed slavery, and they were, socialistic in their economics, not completely socialistic, but, in theory, they were for nationalization of industries and a government that represented the small farmers and such. And they were the People's Party. Okay. So the term populist referred to these people, right? And the reason that we talk about left-wing populism and all of that, this is related to that. So the Populist Party emerged as people that thought the Republican Party had sold out, and it was mainly small farmers. And it was, many of them were in the South, right? They were in the South because the U.S. South, you had the former slave owners, but you also had the recently freed slaves, and you also had the small farmers in the South who didn't like the big plantation owners who'd been the slave owners. And in the South, you had a lot of populists in the South, and there's actually a very good book called Black Labor and Southern Populism. And this book, it's a really, really good book by Vince Copeland. And I don't know. I mean, yeah, here it is for $16 on Amazon. So it's available. It's a very good pamphlet by Vince Copeland. You can probably find a PDF of it, online somewhere, right? But Vince Copeland wrote this pamphlet, Black Labor and Southern Populism, where he talked about how originally the populists were anti-racist. And they talked about how racism was a tool of the big plantation owners and the big monopolies. And the populists, they thought that the Republican Party had abandoned the fight against racism, had sold out the revolution, and that originally the populist movement was anti-racist. However, they were opposing the Republican Party because the Republican Party had sold out. And they represented largely poor white people, small farmers, workers, and others. And their enemy was the Republican Party. And gradually over time, the Populist Party became racist. It didn't start out that way. It started out as very anti-racist. But over time, the Populist Party became more and more racist. And they started, attacking the Republican Party for giving jobs to black people, right? Our tax money are giving jobs to black people while there's good white people who are unemployed, stuff like that, right? Gradually, the Populist Party became more and more racist over time. And it's really unfortunate, but that's how these things develop. And it was largely because they were aligned with the Democrats against the Republicans. The Republicans were seen as the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that defeated slavery. The Democrats were the party of the South, and the populists were against the Republicans. And black people couldn't vote in the South, etc. And gradually the Populist Party became more racist. And then William Jennings Bryan came along, right? You know this guy, William Jennings Bryan. He's a very famous American politician. He never won the presidency, but he was the Democrat candidate for office many times, or on a couple occasions. He was a very well-known, very famous American political leader. He was very famous for being a biblical creationist. The Scopes monkey trial, he was the prosecutor who prosecuted, the teacher for teaching evolution. And William Jennings Bryan was a guy from the Populist Party who brought the populists into the Democrat Party. This guy, William Jennings Bryan, who was an advocate of labor unions, who was, that's the guy from Inherit the Wind, who was an advocate of opposing child labor and was like economically left wing, but he was racist. And he believed in, racial segregation, and he brought the populist movement into the Democratic Party. Right. And so, he was the Democrat Party nominee in like 1898, something like that. And that was the end of the Populist Party. It became a Democratic Party movement with him as the leader of it. Now, what is particularly interesting about this, and this is where it gets very interesting, is part of the reason that the Populist Party lost its oomph. Not only was it that William Jennings Bryan brought it into the Democrat Party, it's also, and this is where it gets very interesting, it's also that socialism emerged as a workers' movement. The Populist Party was a petty bourgeois movement. It was small business owners, small farmers against big monopolies. But socialism emerged as a movement of factory workers. And towards the end of around the time of the turn of the century, 1900 or so, you had socialism emerging, and socialism was different than populism. Socialism called for public ownership of the means of production. It called for a centrally planned economy. And you had, the socialist movement emerged, and many of the populists were becoming socialists rather than being populists. And so populism kind of, lost the radicalism, because many of the most radical populists just became socialists. One of the most important socialists in American history was originally a populist. It was a guy named Edward Bellamy, right? And I talk about Edward Bellamy in this book, right? I quote his essay or his piece, the 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 parable of the water tank is one of the best anti-capitalist allegories I've ever read. And Edward Bellamy was a populist who wrote a science fiction novel. He wrote a science fiction novel called Looking Backward, and it was the best-selling book in the 1890s. And it was about a guy who gets hypnotized and falls asleep, and he wakes up in the year 2000, the far-off distant future, and America is a socialist paradise. It's a Christian socialist paradise. And he describes what America is like in this like high-tech socialist paradise that America has become. Edward Bellamy, who wrote, and we use his essay, The Parable of the Water Tank, in our textbook. Edward Bellamy also, his cousin is the guy who wrote the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. And he was a populist who became a socialist. And you had Daniel DeLeon, and eventually you had Eugene Debs, and that socialism kind of usurped the radical energy. Socialism was a movement of factory workers, whereas populism had been a movement of small farmers. So the small farmers went into the Democratic Party. Socialism became the radical movement of factory workers. So that's, to answer your question, Rachel, populism is a vague term that just means for the people. Now, in my essay that I wrote for Mint Press, I talked about how right-wing populism, until like the 1930s, was an oxymoron. Okay? And this is where it gets really interesting. Populism was always considered left-wing because rallying the people against the elite was what the left did. That's what the French Revolution, that's where left and right comes from. The people that embraced the revolution sat on the left. The people that were more conservative and opposed the revolution sat on the right. And so that's what the left did, is it rallied the people against the elite. So like populism was by definition left-wing. However, after the Great Depression, when there was a big communist movement in Europe, there was a feeling that in order to defeat the communists, the right wing needed to be populist in its own way. And if you read, and this is very interesting, like the Nazis, right? The Nazis were a populist movement, right? They considered themselves to be a mass movement of the people, but the Nazis had big arguments with the right wingers of Germany at the time. For example, one of the main thinkers of the right wing in Germany was Oswald Spengler. And Oswald Spengler, he wrote The Decline of the West, and he believed that democracy itself and any notion of populism was the end of civilization, because he said that you should have leaders that you're trying to impress, that the idea of having elections where the leaders try to get the people's approval is backwards. He says that would be like parents letting their kids write the rules, right? In his mind, the people should all be trying to impress and please the leader, right? And that populism and even democracy, even voting for leaders, went against what was needed. Conservatism and the right wing was always much more of the notion that there are natural authorities. Like there's a natural authority. There's a king who rules over you. Some people are better than others. Some people are superior than others. And that the problems of the world are when you turn it on its head. When the inferior ones get to be the bosses, everything falls apart. Conservatism is kind of, in its essence, like the traditional European right wing is essentially, they're in favor of feudalism, not capitalism, right? They think that feudalism is better because there's natural superiority. Everyone knows and is born into their class, and there's no class struggle, etc. But in order to defeat the communists, you needed to create a populist movement. And many of the populists or many of the right-wingers of Europe did not approve of Mussolini in Italy and did not approve of Hitler because they saw them as populist, and they thought that populism was inherently left-wing. And that's where it gets very, very interesting. And, it was Hitler and Mussolini and fascism that was like the very beginning of what you can call right-wing populism, because there had never been such a thing before. But Hitler and Mussolini, they were saying, look, we're for the common man, we're against the elite, but we're for the common man because we want to restore traditional values. We want to create an authoritarian state. We want to create an empire. right? That they were for the common man against the elite in a way that was in favor of militarism and authoritarianism and conservatism. And that was totally new at the time. No one had ever, that such a thing had never existed. And this is why I urge people to be very, very careful, right? You get a lot of people that say, oh, now is just like the 1930s. No, it's not. And the 1930s was not just like what was there before. That there are certain things that repeat themselves, but politics is constantly evolving, right? You know, right-wing populism in the 1930s was a very new thing that had never existed before, right? And it confused everybody because it's like, wait, what's going on? These guys are populists, but they're right-wingers. This doesn't make any sense. And that's how the Nazis were able to kind of be effective, was the communists and the left had one script. They were for the people against the elites, and that's how they fought the right wing. And then you have right-wingers that come along and say, well, we're for the people, we're against the elites, and actually you're agents of the Jewish bankers, you're agents of the... That confused communists. They did not know how to deal with this. Right. And part of the success of the Nazis was that they were able to kind of take the left, the Social Democrats and the communists off guard by kind of stealing their thunder. And that's something that it's important to talk about because it was, you know, and that politics is always evolving and changing. So right-wing populism was new in the 1930s. And then, and this is where it gets very interesting, left-wing anti-populism didn't emerge until the 50s, right? Again, it was always assumed that being left-wing meant you were a populist. The left, the socialists, the communists, they were for the workers. They were against the big corporations. They were for the common people against the rich. You know, they were for... So left-wing politics was by definition populist because it's, you know, for the people. However, in the 1950s and 60s, you get the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, and you get the work of Hannah Arendt, and you get the work of Susan Sontag, and you get Theodor Adorno, the authoritarian personality, and you get a whole new kind of left-wing politics that argues that Nazism and fascism is rooted in the bullying and conformity of ordinary people. Right? Eichmann in Jerusalem is a left-wing book written by a socialist, Hannah Arendt. Socialist Trotskyite Hannah Arendt. She goes to Jerusalem after they've found Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann is on trial for, you know, murdering thousands of Jews in gas chambers. And he's convicted and he's sentenced to death. And Hannah Arendt goes to his trial and she interviews him and she sits down with Adolf Eichmann. And she writes this horrendous book that was a bestseller in the United States. It's still widely read, and it's called Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Study in the Banality of Evil, which I read that book when I was in college, and I thought it was amazing. I did not understand what it was really getting at. What the book is all about, how Adolf Eichmann was not some supervillain. Adolf Eichmann, this brutal Nazi who killed millions of people or thousands of people in gas chambers, was a normal guy. And he was in the YMCA, and he was just your typical normal not normal German guy. And the Nazis came to power, and so he joined them, and he ended up doing the Holocaust. And that there was nothing about Adolf Eichmann that made him special, right? This mass murdering war criminal was just an ordinary dude. Right. And the point that Hannah Arendt is making is that deep down, ordinary people are Nazis. Right. That Nazism is rooted in the inherent cruelty and bullying and conformity of ordinary people, and that great intellectuals are always persecuted by Eichmanns, by normal people. Normies, right, are always going around beating up the smart and the free and the intellectuals. And that we need to control the ordinary people because Nazi Germany is what happens when the average people get out of control and they're not managed. Well, that narrative presents itself as left-wing because it's anti-fascist, it's against militarism, it's against war propaganda, but it's very, very anti-populist. And it gets rid of the entire understanding of where Nazism came from. Communists understood that fascism and Nazism were rooted in the problems of capitalism, the crisis of overproduction. Capitalism enters a crisis of overproduction. The only way you can solve the crisis without having socialism is to forcibly degrow. And so fascism is a mass movement of, big corporations to forcibly degrow society, create a slave labor underclass, militarize the economy in order to save capitalism. But after World War II, the new left that's funded by the CIA has a completely different narrative. In their version of events, fascism is just ordinary people's mean bully parts. And that shows that you need to control ordinary people because deep down they are fascists. And that becomes a big part of the new left, the hippie counterculture movement that's funded by the CIA, right? Congress for Cultural Freedom Program, Project MK Ultra, go down the line. This is brought to you by the CIA, right? Partisan Review Magazine, all this stuff. Their narrative is left-wing because it's against militarism, it's against conformity, it's certainly not social conservatism. It's very socially liberal. It's all about free love and drugs and all of this, but it's anti-populist. And that's the point. It's anti-populist. And so then you get an anti-populist left wing. And then in response to the hippie counterculture, you have the rise of Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon talks about the silent majority. The silent majority. And there's a hit song, Okie from Muskogee. You ever hear Okie from Muskogee? Right? It's a very popular song among conservatives, even still to this day. And it was a song that was written in, it was actually tongue in cheek. It was intended as satire. It was intended as satire by the folk singer, what was his, Merrill Haggard. But it ended up being, taken seriously as a song against the hippies, how the ordinary person was a conservative. The ordinary person was a conservative and the hippies were a bunch of elitists, right? And it was a hit song of the Nixon Revolution. And the rise of the neocons is I wouldn't even really call them populist. Populism is not exactly right. They weren't populists, but they were kind of appealing to a populist sentiment against the left. And so the left took on this fear of conformity. They're celebrating the individual that feels oppressed by the mob, that is opposed to conformity. That becomes what the left is about. It's not about rallying the workers against the capitalists. It's about protecting the smart intellectuals from, ordinary people that deep down are a bunch of Nazi bully murderers, right? And conformists. It's about protecting people, protecting us from the inherent meanness of the mob, right? Is what left-wing politics becomes. And then right-wing politics is ordinary people that don't have time for none of that, right? They don't have time for this hippie stuff. They just love their country and love their flag. And if you don't like it here, move to another country. That's what right-wing politics, especially in the age of neoconservatism, becomes, right? I'm glad this is helpful. It's a long answer, but this is stuff I think a lot about, right? And so the notion of right-wing populism and left-wing anti-populism, this is all very, very new. What's weird is that the neocons, I wouldn't call them populists because they were elitists. They were definitely elitists. And that the neocons think Trump is very dangerous. They think Trump's populism is very dangerous. You read what any of the neocons say, they distinguish MAGA and neocon are not the same thing. Neocon was the beginning of what you might call MAGA, but neocon was supporting the military. Neocon was supporting the government, was supporting U.S. foreign policy. MAGA is against it, right? Neocon was appealing to popular sentiments, but it was pro-state. It was supporting the military. It was supporting the FBI. It was supporting the policing agencies. It was supporting foreign policy. That was neocon. It was doing it in this ordinary people don't have time for your academic hoity-toity criticism. MAGA is rallying the people against the military, against the police state or the deep state, against all these things, right? And so MAGA is a new brand, and MAGA is appealing to ordinary people's outrage against the state. And that's what makes MAGA different than neoconservatism. And that's why neocons denounce what they call populism, right-wing populism, because it scares them, because neoconservatism is a very, very elitist ideology. So this is where it all gets confusing. There's nothing wrong with populism. I am a populist through and through. And I would say I'm more of a populist than I am left-wing or right-wing. I don't care if something's right-wing or left-wing. I'm for the people, and I'm against imperialism. I'm for economic growth, and I'm for a better life, and I'm not against the people. So, that's why I get along with so many conservatives now, because they have become for the people against the state, against the imperialists, against the, so there you go. But anyway, I'm going to play, this is a cover version of Okie from Muskogee, and then I will start answering other questions.
There was a guy at the bar said he wanted to hear a lot of Merle Haggard. There he is. There's another Merle Haggard song for you, brother. We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take our trips on LSD. We don't burn our draft cards down on Main Street. We like living right and being free. We don't make a party out of loving. We like holding hands and pitching moon. We don't let our hair grow long and shaggy like the hippies out in San Francisco do. And I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, a place where even squares can have a ball. We still wave Old Glory down at the courthouse. White lightning still the biggest thrill of all. Leather boots are still in style for manly footwear. Beads and Roman sandals won't be seen. And football's still the roughest thing on campus. And the kids here still respect the college dean. And I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, a place where even squares can have a ball. We still wave Old Glory down at the courthouse. And white lightning's still the biggest thrill of all. In Muskogee, Oklahoma, USA.
Yeah, that's a song it was originally, Merle Haggard was high on marijuana when he wrote it. And it was a sarcastic joke about the kind of people in America who voted for Richard Nixon, but it became like popular among conservatives because it's like, yes, we're the silent majority. And I think that line in there, it's kind of ironic because that one part of it still kind of matches in light of all of the Palestine rallies. Football's still the roughest thing on campus, and the kids here still respect the college dean. Right. What is it? Yeah. Leather boots are still in style for manly footwear. Beads and Roman sandals can't be seen. Football's still the roughest game on campus, and the kids here still respect the college dean. So that one actually kind of fits the Palestine rallies that have been happening. So there you go. All right. I hope that was a good answer to your question, Rachel. I have a lot to say about that, but it's a topic. Sometimes people ask me questions that really get me going because this is important. So there we go. In the UK, can't stay for the live stream, but I'll watch tomorrow. German Christians stood up against the Nazis. So why was the GDR hostile to Christians? I don't think the GDR was necessarily hostile to Christians. It was an atheistic state because it was, Marxism, Leninism, etc. But, my understanding is there was free practice of Christianity in the GDR. As far as German Christians standing up to Hitler, some did, right? I think, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was it Bonhoeffer, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor who he very much he pushed the line of how far you could criticize Hitler, because you couldn't actually criticize Hitler, right? Or you would go to jail. But he was a pastor who was known to be anti-Nazi, who would give sermons that would get right up to the line. They would get right up to the line. And that in Nazi Germany, the media was very controlled and all of that. So churches were like a place where that was like one of the few places you would have political debate, but it was framed in terms of religion. This is very interesting. But in Nazi Germany, right? And what's also interesting is, so this is where it gets confusing. Hitler was officially a Roman Catholic by faith, right? He was from Bavaria. He was a confessing Catholic. He went and got the Pope's blessing, and he asked the Pope to call a Holy Crusade against the Soviet Union, which the Pope wouldn't do, etc. But Nazi ideology was anti-Christian. The Nazi Party internally, among the leaders, they believed the Bible had been rewritten by Jews. I believe they thought that Jesus had actually been a Persian, and it was Alfred Rosenberg was the guy who was the Nazi propagandist who developed their theory of what Christianity really was. And they didn't accept the Bible, and they believed that Hitler was actually a Persian, or that Jesus was actually a Persian, and that the Bible had been rewritten as a conspiracy of Jews to make Europeans weak, and that they had this whole interpretation that Alfred Rosenberg came up with. But they didn't give it publicly, because the German people were Christians largely, and they would reject it. So publicly, the Nazi Party embraced Christianity, but internally, they were really into pre-Christian Germanic paganism, and they had some weird conspiracy theories about the Bible and things like that Alfred Rosenberg was the guy who promoted them. So it all gets very, very interesting. But officially, in the time of the Nazis, officially in Nazi Germany, the country was Catholic and Lutheran, right? The Lutheran Church was the main Protestant church, and then there was Catholicism. And Bavaria is historically Catholic. Other regions are historically Protestant. But you had Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a very famous Lutheran pastor who would give sermons that would criticize Hitler. The one that I heard about was, right? I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he would give sermons that would vaguely criticize Hitler. I'm trying to remember exactly what the famous anecdote was. But I think he said something like, we shouldn't be teaching our children to be violent. We shouldn't teach our children to hate. And he said something like that, which is pretty basic Christian stuff, right? Don't teach your kids to hate. So then the story is a Nazi in his church got up and shouted, "I don't think somebody who doesn't have children should be telling me how to parent." And then he replied, he said, "How dare you speak of our leader Hitler that way?" Now, you think about it, that's weird, but in a government, in a context where you cannot openly criticize the government, right? He's giving a sermon, don't teach your children to hate. And somebody in the audience who knows that he's anti-Hitler says, you shouldn't be telling me how to raise my kids if you don't have children. Or says, someone who doesn't have children shouldn't tell me how to raise my kids. And then he says to them, how dare you speak of Hitler that way? And that's an epic burn, a sick burn on Hitler, right? That he could get away with, because it sounds like he's defending Hitler. And he's pointing out that Hitler is telling everyone to raise their children to hate. And it's stuff like that. And that the church was the place where there would be vague criticism of the Nazis. And so, and then Dietrich Bonhoeffer was eventually, he got the death penalty, right? I believe they just killed him, right? Towards the end of the war, they just knew he was anti-Nazi. And so they just killed him, right? It didn't matter. right? But he was, and so the church was like one institution that was able to criticize the Nazis. Now, a lot has been written about Sophie Scholl, right? And this is interesting, Sophie Scholl, right? Sophie Scholl was some kind, I believe she was a pacifist. She was like if I remember correctly, she was like a Mennonite or something like that. And Sophie Scholl, she had like a secret society, the White Rose Society, that was urging Nazi Germany to surrender during the war. And if their leaflets were not particularly anti-fascist, it was like, sign a peace deal so we don't lose everything. And it was like Germany was already losing the war, and she was leafleting, let's urge Hitler to sign a peace deal so we don't lose everything. But if you really found out what she was about, she was actually like, I think she was a Mennonite or something like that. And that she was just a pacifist. She was opposed to militarism. And she and her friends put up leaflets everywhere urging Hitler to sign a peace deal. And they were Christians, and they got the death penalty. They were beheaded, and they're famous. A lot of pacifists have kind of made Sophie Scholl into a martyr, right? And there's multiple movies about her, about the life of Sophie Scholl. As this Christian who was opposed to World War II and was opposed to Hitler, and passed out leaflets urging an end to World War II and got the death penalty for it. So, I mean, what the person said in their super chat about Christians opposing Hitler, that's true, but it's not universal. It's true because the people who originally opposed Hitler were the communists, and they were all thrown in concentration camps and forcibly outlawed. But the church was a legal institution in Nazi Germany, and it was a place where one could get away with it. One could get away with, criticizing the Nazis in kind of a vague way, because the church had to be tolerated. And it is true that the Nazis, they were not Christian at the top, right? Publicly, they were Christian, but internally, they were Germanic pagans. They had their own weird interpretation, Alfred Rosenberg and all this. So it's complicated. That's my answer to you, right? There is a huge amount of oversimplification whenever you hear the left or the right talk about the Nazis. And I think Gavin is in the chat, and he would agree with me about this. Whenever you hear the left talk about the Nazis, they're always like, oh, the Nazis, anyone who doesn't agree with immigration is a Nazi. Not that simple. And the right, too. The right are like, oh, the Nazis were all gay. Well, they also outlawed homosexuality and put all the gay people in concentration camps. But when they started in the early years, yes, they were a highly gay organization. Their leader, the leader of the street fighting group, was an openly gay man. I mean, so it's complicated, right? And that's one thing about Nazism and the history of Nazis in Germany, is it's always way more complicated than you think. And that we do need to get past this notion of Hitler did X, so I've won the argument. You got to get past that, because Nazi Germany, it's not going to happen that way again. Fascism is happening right now, right? The capitalist system is in a prolonged crisis of overproduction, and they are trying to solve it with degrowth, and they have built a mass movement to try and build, degrowth and forcibly, stabilizing capitalism with destruction. That is happening. However, let me add, it's not happening in the same way, and we shouldn't expect it to happen the same way, just like in Nazi Germany, right? The Nazis were the first time. No one had ever thought of right-wing populism before. It didn't exist before. So to assume that fascism is going to sound exactly the way it did. I mean, when it emerged, it was new and original, right? No one had ever considered right-wing populism, but it happened, right? And so it's much more complicated, right? And this, this idea that when fascism comes, it's going to be an exact copy of Nazism. It's not that simple. And, and left and right don't really make any sense in the period we're living in. So this assumption that the Nazis will be right-wing, it's like right-wing according to who, right? Right-wing in the sense that they oppose historical progress, right-wing in the sense that they believe in degrowth, right? I mean, because there's plenty of left-wing people that believe in degrowth. There's plenty of left-wing people that don't believe in historical progress and want us to go back to some primitive ideal. Many things that are, what does right-wing and left-wing even mean? Left-wing, in theory, means historical progress. Right-wing means you don't want historical progress. Left-wing means you want historical progress. But what does progress mean? Who's to say we're getting better, right? This is where it all gets very, very confusing. So yes, the Nazis called themselves a right-wing movement. They did glorify the past. They did consider communists and leftists to be their main enemy. That is all true, right? And conservatives often try to gloss over that and pretend that's not true, and they're wrong. They are wrong when they say the Nazis, oh, the Nazis were liberals, the Nazis were leftists and socialists. Well, they were right-wing anti-capitalists. They considered themselves to be right-wing. They considered their enemies to be left-wing. It's more complicated than that, right? But yes, they did criticize capitalism. Yes, criticism of capitalism was part of their movement. Yes, they were populists. Yes, they did claim that they were believers in historical progress. It's complicated, is the point. And when fascism comes again, it won't look like that. And we're seeing fascism emerge again, and it's not that. The essence of fascism is economic. The essence of fascism is economic. And that is what you need to remember. And that as is widely pointed out, right? The fascist ideology is made up to justify what fascists do. Right? The ideology is second. Fascism is the practice. It is not the ideology. The ideology is what they make up in order to justify what it is that they are already going to do. And that is what a lot of people don't get. And they try to make it like, well, there's this ideology, and if you put it into practice, that's fascism. And it's like, no, there's not some ideology that if you put it into practice, that's fascism. It's rather that fascism comes in, makes up an ideology to justify what it is already going to do. And that ideology looks different in different times and different places. It looks different because, it's necessary to sell what they are doing differently in different times and places. And that's the point. That is the point. That is the point. So the next super chat is from John, right? And John says, show me an old rebel. And rather than read it myself, I have video of John reciting it. But I'm having trouble downloading that video. It is downloading very, very slowly. So maybe it will speed up downloading it. I don't know. I can try and maybe downloading it another way. But that is a great poem that you read at our retreat, and we have video of you reading it. So why don't we just put the video of you reading the Old Rebel poem? Because, it's a great piece by Caitlin Johnstone. It's a great piece. And I think reading it would be a great contribution. And you read it very beautifully at our Kansas, Missouri gathering 2 years ago. So why don't we just put it on? And I found a quicker way to download it, it looks like. Okay, so yeah, we'll just have a performance from John of the piece. Okay, all right, here we go. All right, hold on. All right, so we will put John reading Caitlin Johnstone's Old Rebel on. Okay, we have to skip through this video.
Jackson, we're good.
All right, we'll have to skip through this video till we get to John. All righty.
This is probably too young of a crowd to apply to most of you, but you all probably know somebody it does apply to. And she calls it, Show Me an Old Rebel. Do not show me a young rebel whose eyes are bright and whose tail is bushy. Young rebels are fine and good, but they are merely doing what the young are meant to do. Show me an old rebel, one who keeps punching when his hands are arthritic, when her hair is white, when his friends are all dead, when her knees are shot, when it hurts him to pee, when her shoulders are so bad that it would be much easier to punch down than to punch up. Show me an old rebel who keeps standing up after being knocked down over and over again. year after year, decade after decade, who after the 1,000th blow merely spits out a tooth and says, "Son, you have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? Are you a young rebel, sticking it to the man? Are you upsetting the gray brainiacs and knocking over their word castles? That is fine. Youth will be youth. But show me a young rebel who became an old rebel, who stuck with it through the attack, through the setbacks and the beatings and betrayals, who watched the hippies become yuppies, and the protesters become pundits, and still kept the fire lit amid the monsoons of infiltration and the hurricanes of heartbreak, who will close their tired eyes for a final time without ever once having cast them to the ground or peered up in imploring subordination. That, my friends, that is a true spirit. If you are still a fiery rebel, even as everything is ripped away from you, I will be humbled and awed by you, because I will know that you will carry that with you to the grave. And I will know that whatever you find on the other side will be met with that same defiant glare. And I will sing your song when you are gone.
Yeah, that was John McCarthy performing, that great piece by Caitlin Johnstone. So thank you. I think it's very applicable. And that's why I want to talk about people like my friend Paul. So there you go. All right. Thank you, Lion. I do appreciate it. Thanks, Caleb. Explaining songs is a forte. Is it? I don't know. I mean, let me just say this, since you think explaining songs is a forte. There is a song that many people have probably heard. It's an old English song that was made, it's just a well-known English folk song. It's called Scarborough Fair. And it was made popular again in the 70s by Simon and Garfunkel. And it took me years to finally figure out what the song was about. Right? Simon and Garfunkel rewrote it or redid it in the 70s. Is like they put like anti-war messages behind it or something, but it's just an old English song, an old English tragic love song. And it took me for years, because it's really old. It's from the time of King Henry VIII. It's a very old song. And it took me years to figure out what it's actually about. And when I figured it out, I felt so satisfied, right? And maybe I'm just foolish, but I always found it to be weird, right? And it is weird. I think it's old English, and that's why it's not so obvious what it's about. But let me see if I can find somebody performing Scarborough Fair. You can listen to it. And then I will, since you like this, right? Since you like me analyzing songs, I will put on somebody performing Scarborough Fair, right? Not the Simon and Garfunkel version, just the classic Scarborough Fair. I will put on Scarborough Fair, the classic old English love song. And then based on that, I will tell you what it's actually about. And when I figured out and I kind of decoded the lyrics, I felt very proud of myself. And I explained it to some other people and they got it too. And it took me a long time to really understand the lyrics because it's old English. But Scarborough Fair. Let me find the old English love song, not the Simon and Garfunkel version, just the old English love song, Scarborough Fair. I'm going to find a version of Scarborough Fair, the old English love song, and then we will decode it for you. I just have to find a version that I'm not going to get hit with some copyright or something. Why should there be a copyright issue with a song that is this old, right? I mean, you know, the lyrics should have been uncopyrighted about 100 generations over, but whatever. So let me find a version I can play on here and not get hit with a copyright strike. And I'd like to find a version that is not the Simon and Garfunkel version, which is very annoying. I find a million people performing this, Simon and Garfunkel, and that is not the version I want to play. I just want to do the old English love song. Wow, here's someone singing it in Chinese. I did not know it had been translated into Chinese. I'm not going to put that on because, we're talking about the lyrics and that won't help us, but there we go. All righty. Just trying to find a version I can get away with playing on here. And I hope it's good too. And that's always the risk when you look for a song on the internet. You've never. Okay. All right. This version I think I can get away with playing. All right. So this is Scarborough Fair, the old English love song. And then I will explain to you what the lyrics are about if you didn't already know. I mean, there's probably somebody watching right now who's like, duh, Caleb, I know what it's about. Well, got to tell you, most people who listen to this song have no clue what to make of the lyrics just because it's written in archaic English, right? And it took me a long time to finally make sense of the lyrics. And one day I was just sitting there and I was going over the lyrics to Scarborough Fair in my head, and I got it. And it made sense, right? You can probably Google it now, but that's not as much fun. So I will put on the old English love song, Scarborough Fair, and then I will tell you what the lyrics are actually saying, how it makes sense, and then you'll get it. So here we go. It's downloading. It's downloading, right? And thank you. Thank you for saying I have a forte of explaining songs. I don't think I do, but I mean, whatever. I have a forte of explaining old songs, perhaps, right? Not new ones, or I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of that with like people interpreting the lyrics to songs and stuff like that. I don't do that on these streams as much, right? Right. There's like internet forums where they're debating, what Beatles music is about and all of that. So, I mean, sometimes you don't even want to know. You almost don't want to know sometimes, right? I mean, like, there's a Beatles song called Happiness is a Warm Gun, right? And apparently it is about shooting up heroin, right? It's either about that or it's about something else. I mean, but the more you listen to it, the more you realize, okay, it's like you almost don't want it to be, I don't know. Okay, so now, why is this being annoying? Okay, it downloaded it and then it didn't download the full file and it didn't open it. And that's annoying. So now I have to start the download all over again. And I don't know why that happened, but it did. But it did. All right. But anyhow, just trying to download that. But while I'm waiting for this to download, I'll thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for your super chat. Much appreciated. What else we got here? What is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and what does the private property argument mean in communism? Sure. All right. Well, first thing is that that Marx argued that the world is gradually marching toward higher modes of production. Each mode of production involves a new class taking power. Class struggle is the motive of history, right? And that there was a struggle to overthrow feudalism. Before that, you had, hunter-gatherer civilization. There was a struggle that led to the creation of slavery and the dawn of agriculture. And there was a struggle that led to feudalism. And then there was a struggle that led to the creation of capitalism. And then in capitalism, you have the workers, the proletariat, and the capitalists, right? And that Marx distinguished between socialism, which is a new economic system in which the economy is rationally organized, there's central planning of the means of production, and the government. That in order to create socialism, the government needed to be seized by the workers, right? And the word dictatorship is probably a poor translation, but it's like under this system, we have the rule of the capitalists, or the dictatorship of those who have the money, the dictatorship of the capitalists. So socialism would require the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the dictatorship of the workers, the rule of the workers, right? And that it's through the creation of a working class government that then the means of production can be centralized and you can have a socialist economic system. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the political revolution that then is able to bring about the new economic system, right? That is what Marx is talking about. It's the rule of the proletariat. Right now, we live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and the idea is that through the class struggle, eventually the working class seizes control of the government and establishes the dictatorship of the proletariat. Second question, the private property argument. Okay, the Communist Manifesto makes a very big distinction between personal property and private property. And this is a point of confusion because a lot of places, Karl Marx says, we seek to abolish private property. And people will say, oh, no, you don't. You're not taking my house. You're not taking my car. You're not taking my toothbrush. That's mine. And Marx says that's your personal property because you use it. If you interact with it in any way, that's personal property. It's not private property. Private property refers to things that are used to make more money. Right? It refers to means of production, mechanisms for creating wealth. And he's saying we seek to abolish the private ownership of the means of production. We seek to abolish private property in the means of production, and that we want personal property to expand, right? And that's the point, right? You should have more shirts and more toothbrushes and more homes and cars. We want personal property to vastly expand. But the road to doing that is the abolition of private property, which is property that you have nothing to do with, right? And that's an important argument to make that a lot of Marxists just kind of skip over. And it's actually very important because working people, a lot of them have worked very, very hard to have their personal property. And they see communism as coming to take that away from them. They worked really, really hard to have a car, a nice car. They worked really, really hard to have a decent sized house. And they see communism as coming to take away their private property and redistribute it. And they don't want that. Well, actually, no, we want your personal property that you actually use to expand. Communism is about abolishing private property in the means of production so that personal property can expand. Right? But nowadays, this doesn't even really apply because most socialist countries have private property in the means of production to some degree or other. It's heavily regulated. But, you go to China, there's privately owned businesses. There's, so it's not, personal property is expanding in China, but there's private property in the means of production in China also, right? So 21st century socialism, there's a lot of private property in terms of the means of production, right? So it's not that simple, but generally the classical standard Marxist-Leninist understanding is that communists seek to abolish private property in the means of production in order to expand personal property for individuals. So yeah, I am at the point that I think there is a role for private property in the means of production to some degree or other, as long as it is regulated as part of an overall planned economy to make sure we have economic growth. So I'm not in the classical mode, but if you want to talk about the classic Marxist-Leninist understanding, that's the private property argument. So I just explained both of those things. I'm curious, Captain Vadar, I feel like you were testing me a little bit. And that's fine, right? I mean, you're allowed to test me. But I feel like you're seeing if I'm familiar with the standard way of making these arguments, or you're seeing, how much of a standard ML I am, right? And I just gave you my answer, but I also told you that I think that there is role, there is a role for some private property in the means of production. I am not opposed to private property in the means of production as a part of a socialist society. But it's interesting that you asked that. I'd be curious if you were, testing me to see how well of an ML I am, if you're an ML yourself, or I'm curious what's going on there. All right. So now we can play Scarborough Fair, since it fits in with someone's talking to me about song lyrics. I hope this is a good version. We shall see. It's a version that I will probably be able to get away with playing on here. All right, here we go. Okay, it is the Simon and Garfunkel version. There's nothing we can do about that.
parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Sparrows, no crested rose, without nose, seems no needle birds, a child of heaven. Then she'll be a true lover. Sleeps arrow and clarion call. Tell her to find me an acre of land, sprinkling of parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. With silvery tears between the salt waters and the sea strands in Polish. Then she'll be a true love of mine. Tell her to rip it in a circle of leather. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, and gathered it all in a bunch of heather long ago forgotten. She'll be a true love of mine. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to the one who is there. She once was a true love of mine.
All right. Okay. So that's the Old English love song, Scarborough Fair. Took me years to finally decode the lyrics. Now, there's probably somebody watching this who knew what it meant all along, but because it's written in Old English, it's a little bit hard to calculate. So the first verse, are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine, right? So it's like lost love, right? Then all the verses after that are listing impossible tasks. And the point is that it is impossible for the man to marry the woman as he desires to do. And he's communicating to her how sad he is about the fact that he cannot marry her. And so he's listing impossible tasks and saying, if only we could do blank, then we could be together. For example, tell her to make me, a something shirt without no seam or needlework. Well, every shirt is going to have threads in it. You can't have a shirt without any seams or needlework, right? Tell her to find me an acre of land between the salt water and the sand. Well, there's nothing between the ocean and the beach. So an acre of land between the salt water and the sea sand, it could not exist, right? Tell her to reap this land with a sickle of leather. Well, think about leather. Does leather cut? Reaping is you're growing crops, right? And, it's when you cut the crops. You cannot cut crops with a sickle that is made out of leather. It's not sharp. It's not going to cut it's not going to cut the wheat or the grain or whatever it is you're harvesting. You cannot cut with a sickle of leather, right? And that's the point. He's saying, I can't be with you. I'm sad about the fact that I cannot be with you. And he's listing all these impossible things that if only we could do these things, then we could be together. It took me a long time to figure that out because of the archaic terminology. So I remember when I finally pieced together what the song was saying. And he's bemoaning the tragedy that he cannot marry the woman, right? And he's illustrating how impossible it is to marry the woman. That's what he's saying. It took me a long time to figure that out, but it's actually, when you think about it, it's like, oh, okay, it all makes sense. So there you go. We don't know why he can't, right? What's also interesting is that, in the first verse, he's not talking to her. He's talking to somebody who's going to the Scarborough Fair. And he's saying, oh, if you see her, remind her of me because I used to love her. And then he's talking to her for the remaining verses. And that's a little weird, right? Wouldn't he be talking to her the whole time? But the first verse is, it's like someone says, hey, I'm going to Scarborough Fair. And someone else is, and he's then, oh, years ago, there was a girl there I really wanted to marry, and it didn't work out. And then the rest of the song is him actually talking to the woman, right? So, yeah, there you go, right? Or is he talking to the woman? It's tell her, right? So maybe he's telling the person who will see her at the fair that he can't be with her, right? And how sad he is about it, right? Tell her to find me an acre of land, right? Tell her to make me a shirt, etc. No, the anti-war stuff, that's Simon and Garfunkel, right? So when Simon and Garfunkel recorded it themselves, they did Scarborough Fair, the Old English song, and then they recorded their own anti-war song next to it. And they did the two songs on top of each other, right? The actual song doesn't have anti-war lyrics in it. That's Simon and Garfunkel. That's the 70s. They're hippies. They're anti-war, whatever, right? Right? The original Scarborough Fair is just those lyrics I recited to you. The whole general orders is soldier to kill, child of the mountain, all of that. That's Simon and Garfunkel. That's why I didn't want to play that version for you, because that's not in the original song, right? That's Simon and Garfunkel. But when you Google Scarborough Fair, like I did, and you try to find a version you can play on your stream, the chances are, even if it's not labeled that way, you're going to find Simon and Garfunkel. And they called it Scarborough Fair / Canticle. And whatever Canticle is, that's where all those anti-war lyrics come from. Those are from something that Simon and Garfunkel wrote called Canticle. And I don't know how it's related to the Old English song at the time of Henry VIII, Scarborough Fair. Don't know how that works. But, what's interesting is that there's a couple Old English love songs, right? There's Scarborough Fair and Green Sleeves. Do you know Green Sleeves? Right? Green Sleeves, around the same time, there's Green Sleeves. And some people even claim that King Henry VIII wrote Green Sleeves and that he invented the recorder and then he wrote Green Sleeves for the recorder. Now, a lot of people say that's not true, that he was just the king and they gave him credit for it. But do you know the song Green Sleeves, right? This is an Old English love song. It's from roughly the same time. And it's got that same kind of sadness to it. And I really like Green Sleeves, to tell you the truth. And they've turned Green Sleeves into a Christmas carol. I'm not even going to go there. But I actually really like the song Green Sleeves. So I'm going to find Green Sleeves, and I'm going to find a performance of Green Sleeves that I can get away with showing on here. And I'm going to see if I can put Green Sleeves on, because it's a beautiful, old, sad English song composed around roughly the same time. And I'm going to see if I can get away with showing Green Sleeves. So, yeah, that's an Old English love song that I really do appreciate, is Green Sleeves. Do people in the chat know Green Sleeves? Very famous. Very famous. Again, they said King Henry VIII wrote it and that he also invented the recorder. I don't think he did either of those things. I do think he had 6 wives. I do think he ended up leaving the Catholic Church so he could get a divorce. But did he actually did he write Green Sleeves and invent the recorder? I don't think so. I think he was just given credit because he was the king, and that's what you did back then. The king was the great inventor. But why am I having so much trouble finding a version of Greensleeves that I can put on here, right? I just need to make sure there's people singing lyrics. Oh, here we go. I think I can play this version. Okay, here we go. Greensleeves. All right. This is I don't think I can play this version. Sorry. I thought that version I could play, but it would be a little bit of a risk. I need to find a version that's safer to play. Here we go. Okay, here we go. I can definitely play this version. All right. I found a version I can play and not have copyright issues. That's always the challenge with anything like this, right? Is that you put the wrong song on and then you get, your channel taken down or whatever. So I don't want to have that issue, right? I want to find amateurs performing it. Not a big record company and etc. All right. We'll put on Greensleeves. I'm not going to analyze the lyrics because I think it's pretty basic. The guy is in love with a woman. It's not a Christmas song. Well, they took the lyrics and they took the tune and they made it into What Child Is This? But it's originally an Old English love song called Greensleeves. And I'm not going to interpret the lyrics for you. It's pretty basic. The guy's in love with a woman who has green sleeves, which probably means she was nobility, because in order to have clothing that was colored, etc., you were in nobility. So he's in love with a woman who's in the class of nobility. That's really all it is, right? And it's also a I Can't Marry You song. So here we go.
Alas, my love, it to me wrong to cast me off discourteously, and I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Greensleeves was all my joy, Greensleeves was my delight, Greensleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady Greensleeves? I have been ready at your hand to grant whatever you would crave. I have both waged life and land, your love and goodwill for to have. Greensleeves was all my joy, Greensleeves was my delight, Greensleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady Greensleeves? Well, I will pray to God on high, that though my cause and sin may see, and that yet was before I died, thou wilt vouchsafe to love me. Greensleeves was all my joy, Greensleeves was my delight, Greensleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady
So we've only got 2 more super chats left, and they're both very, well, yeah, they're both very important, and I will answer them. But somebody asked me to analyze this psychoanalytically, and I can do that very quickly, which is that psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, he had an understanding, and he pointed out, which a lot of us don't realize, that it's kind of like the unity of opposites. But if you were never hungry, you would find no pleasure in eating. If you were never tired, you would find no pleasure in sleeping. And that part of satisfaction is craving, right? And that's why Coke is such a successful invention, because Coke makes you thirsty. If you drink Coke, you get thirsty, and then you want to drink more Coke, and then you get more thirsty, and then you want to drink more Coke. And it repeats this cycle in your brain where you crave and you fulfill your craving. And both Greensleeves and Scarborough Fair are about an unfulfilled craving. That's what they're about, right? This guy loves Greensleeves, but he just can't have her. This guy loves the woman who is near Scarborough Fair, and he just can't have her. But there's something oddly, even in the frustration and the sadness of not having the one you love, there's an odd beauty there. It's like the joy of longing for something, right? Both of them are sad songs, but there's a happiness to them. They're not like suicide songs. They're poignant songs. That's the point, right? And both of those songs very much capture. They're both sad songs, but they're happy sad. And while the person is sad, he can't have Greensleeves, or he can't have the woman in Scarborough. He's celebrating how much in awe of her beauty he is. That's the point. That's the point, right? So psychoanalytically, it is about the joy of craving, which we never want to admit. We think of craving as being frustrating, and we think we don't want to crave, but deep down, if you really know your inner desires, you do desire to crave, because if you would never crave, you would never be satisfied. You have to crave in order to have your craving be satisfied. And even craving itself brings us joy, even when that craving cannot be fulfilled. That is the point. I hope that psychoanalytically, that's my Freudian interpretation of that. And that's something that Sigmund Freud talks a lot about, is craving, fulfillment. That's the anal stage, like the baby enjoys pooping, right? He always talks about that because he's Sigmund Freud and he's gross. But he always talks about that. So it's kind of like that. All right. Anyway, I'm resending my chat from last night since I'm noticing some didn't go through. I haven't had it happen with other channels. Thank you again for all you do. Well, it did go through last night, Molly, and I received it, and I appreciate this one tonight as well, and I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And, tonight I was in a grouchy mood. I was a little bit embarrassed. I got a little bit hung out of shape. Someone in the chat got me fired up, and I unloaded a lot of stuff that wasn't necessary for the message I was delivering that night. But I watched it, and I think I'm going to leave it up. Sometimes you just got to be real with people, right? And I mean, that is what makes our community special, is that it's real. Our community is real. I am before you, warts and all, as I like to quote Oliver Cromwell. This is a very English podcast, right? We're talking about it's very British. We're talking about Jacobites and Bonnie Prince Charlie and Greensleeves and Scarborough Fair and Oliver Cromwell. It doesn't get more Anglo than this podcast. Anyway. But I'm just we talk about Sigmund Freud. He's from Austria. So it's not completely Anglo, but there we go. This is a pretty Anglo podcast. I'm on here with my red hair and my, light skin and oh boy. But there we go. There we go. All right. But thank you, Molly. Thank you very much. Thank you. I do appreciate it. And it's an honor to come on and be with all of you every night. I'm before you, warts and all, right? They thought they could destroy me by violating my privacy and all of that. And they didn't, right? I am relentless. And that's what some of these people just don't understand. I will keep going. I will not surrender. I will not surrender because I need this. It's not just that I get fulfillment from this. It's like I need to do this. This is being part of a community, having comrades, sharing a life of struggle. That is how I know to live. And it has brought me fulfillment. And I see a lot of people in this world that are suffering that could use some of that same kind of fulfillment. And I hope that I can bring you into this life. And it's not for everybody. And it has its dangers and it has its downfalls and it's hard. And some people can do it for a little while and then they go back to living biologically. But I will never go back to living biologically because this is who I am. And this is how I know how to exist. And there have been times in my life where my activism and my being part of a community of struggle has stopped, and it is very painful for me. I need to live this way. This is how I know to live. This is how I know to exist with other people. And it's honestly, it's a great way of doing it, right? Life is struggle and struggle is life. If you want to change things, you got to learn things. If you want to learn things, you've got to change things. And life is struggle. Living biologically, is there a different kind of life? Yes. If you are living in the struggle, you're in a movement, you're organizing, you're building revolutionary politics and anti-imperialism, you are really alive. And if you are not doing that, you are technically alive in the biological sense, but you're not really alive because you're not awakened. Right. And I know that that's, people say that's cult language or whatever. I don't care at this point. Sometimes some different communist groups use that terminology and I like it because it hits home with me, because I can tell you when I am only living biologically, I am not a happy person. Right. I find fulfillment through a life of struggle. And this is what it truly means to be alive. And before I ever heard anyone talk about living biologically versus living regularly, before I ever heard that terminology, I said that. I remember feeling this is what makes me feel alive. This is my purpose, etc. So I hope that you can find the joy of being part of a revolutionary movement. So there you go. I hope you can find that joy. I hope I can help you to find that joy. So there we go. So on that note, I am going to put on the closing music. It's always a pleasure to... Oh, we do have one more. Are you a fan of Carl von Weber? I've never heard of him, Lewis. I wish I could give you more of an answer. I'm going to Google him because you did send a super chat, Lewis. Carl von Weber. I am not a fan of him. I don't know him well enough. But he lived from 1786 to 1826. I should listen to some of his music, right? I don't know my classical music very well. He influenced Wagner, who I like, Chopin, who I also like, Mendelssohn, Liszt. I don't know Weber very well. I listen to Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart generally. I do like Wagner, though Wagner is highly emotional, and I do like Chopin. But I don't know classical music as well as I should. Right. I'm not a LaRouche member. I never was a member of the LaRouche organization, contrary to what you've heard. I've studied LaRouche and I think he made great contributions. But I was never a member of his movement. I know they are only classical music. That's a big part of the LaRouche movement, is they only listen to classical music. I've never been that way. Right. I use classical music. I wake up in the morning with classical music. I go to sleep with classical music. And I feel like my life has greatly improved because of that habit, because it's more stabilizing, it's less emotional, etc. But there you go. There you go. I don't know Carl von Weber well enough to comment on him, but there you go. I love how these streams, we talked a lot about music tonight, and I think it added something special. So there we go. All right. Now I'm going to put on the closing music. Thank you, everybody. It's been fun, and I'll be back probably tomorrow night, if not the next night after that. And yeah, this is fun. This is awesome. Thanks, everybody. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging
revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.